Hey, everybody. Today we're debating the book of Daniel, prophecy or forgery, and we are starting right now. As I hand it over to our collaborating co-moderator, Samuel Nassan from Explain Apologetics. Thrilled to be with you and collaborate with you in hosting this epic debate. Samuel, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, James, for being willing to do this. And hello, everyone, whether you're watching from Explain Apologetics YouTube channel or James Kuhn's Modern Day Debate channel, we welcome you to this epic debate where we have, I believe, about four PhDs being divided between our four panelists today. So yeah, it's an exciting debate, one of those debates that has very, very academic and all that. So you're going to be enjoying this debate if you're really looking for some substantive debate. The topic, as mentioned, is going to be on the authorship of the book of Daniel. We want to discuss whether the book of Daniel was actually prophecy. And if you've watched debates on messianic prophecies, Christians hold that the book of Daniel was prophesying Jesus and prophesying a lot of other things as well, as we will see in this debate. Atheists, of course, may hold the view that the book of Daniel is a forgery. This debate will be dealing with that exact topic. And so to represent the Christian side, we have Dr. Stephen Boyce and Jonathan Sheffield. Dr. Stephen Boyce has completed two doctorates. He'll be graduating with his PhD, majoring in textual criticism pretty soon. And let me just invite Dr. Stephen Boyce just to say a few words about who he is and what he's doing.
Yeah, my name's Stephen Boyce. I'm with City Light Apologetics, working alongside three current church plants right now and working through different guides and debates and working through discussions and dialogues and research. And mostly my work is in canon and text, as Samuel said. Most of my debates are in this arena. I'm actually excited about doing a book, not about a passage particularly or manuscript differences. That one gets fun, but it also gets old. It's nice to do something new. And I'm enjoying the fact that we're going to do something in the Old Testament. I only get invited for New Testament stuff, so it's actually fun to do something in the Old Testament for once.
Thank you for that, Dr. Stephen Boyce. And we also have Jonathan Sheffield representing the Christian side, defending the authenticity of the book of Daniel. Jonathan, you're no stranger to modern day debate, done lots of debates, and also to Explain Apologetics. We've had you on before. You're, as we always say in Explain Apologetics, our favorite Anglican. Just share with us a little bit about what you've been up to these days.
Okay. My name is Jonathan Sheffield. Grew up in the Anglican tradition. I have a channel where I've kind of dedicated the last 4 or 5 years to defending the reliability of the New Testament. I've actually put my theses together in the form of 2D and 3D cartoon animations, make them a little more fun and break down some of the technical matter. And once again, it's good to reacquaint myself with Mr. Majors. We have a kind of long history going back, so it's good to see him and then get to work with Dr. Josh as well to have this discussion. So very pleased to come on the show and share our views today.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. And we have, representing the atheist side, we have Dr. Josh with us and Jim Majors. Dr. Josh, you've done your PhD in Ancient Near Eastern Language from Johns Hopkins University. It's a pleasure to have you on both in Explain Apologetics and Modern Day Debate. Just kindly share with us what you've been up to as well.
Yeah, so I got my master's in theology from Capital Bible Seminary, and then got accepted to Johns Hopkins and got a PhD in Assyriology, Ancient Near Eastern Studies, with a minor in Hebrew Bible. And my wife and I run Digital Hammurabi, which is our YouTube channel, and we focus on just bringing good scholarship from the Ancient Near East and the Hebrew Bible to non-specialists that are interested in that sort of thing.
Great, it's fascinating, and yeah, again, joy to have you on this channel. And Steve and James is, yeah, Jim, you're no stranger to all of us. We, in fact, yeah, you've been on Modern Day Debate plenty of times, and it's a joy to have you on Explain Apologetics for the first time. And also, for those of you watching from Explain Apologetics at the Explain conference, Jim will be there debating again on Messianic prophecies as well. So, pleasure to have you on, Jim.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I've always enjoyed coming on both yours and James' platform.
Yeah, and Jim, you've been you're doing your PhD on the Book of Daniel as well. So all of you are kind of like authorities on this area. Could you just share with us a little bit also about what you've been up to?
So just finishing up the spring semester. So I'm helping my professor review some exams, review some final papers being written at the end of the semester. Just getting ready for summer, honestly. So winding down a lot, doing the final revisions on my my dissertation, which I have the whole summer to do, but I've been buckling down on it since I received it back about I don't know, a few weeks ago. So focusing on getting that done and hopefully graduating in the fall semester.
That's exciting, man. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are about ready to begin the debate. Let me just briefly run through the format with you before we begin. Opening statements of 20 minutes for each side. They will allow them the liberty to decide who takes however much of that 20 minutes. We will, however, have a grace period of about 1 minute after the 20 minutes, because as I said, since they are scholars and all that, we don't want to cut them off in the middle of their point. 1 additional minute of grace will be given, but after that, we will, but I doubt they will cross that line. Rebuttal period, we will be having 10 minutes of a rebuttal period, followed by 2 rounds of cross-examination of 10 minutes each. Basically, each one of these speakers will have 10 minutes to cross-examine the other 2, unless, of course, he decides to cross-examine his partner as well. After that, we're going to be having also 30 minutes of just open discussion, kind of to summarize all that was being done in the debate. There will be no closing statements and Q&A to follow. I understand, James, that they can, you're accepting super chats and all that. Do you want to brief us on that?
Absolutely. So, folks, if you happen to have a question, feel free to fire it into the live chat. If you tag me with Modern Day Debate, that makes it easier for me to see it. And super chat is also an option, in which case we'll read the super chats first. And want to remind you, folks, if you love juicy debates, well, consider hitting that subscribe button, as we have many more to come. And also, down below in the description box, whether you are listening via YouTube or via Modern Day Debate on podcast, all of our guests are linked, and we encourage you to check out our guest links, as we really do appreciate them being with us.
Thank you, James. All right, with that, we're going to have the affirmative side, in this case, the ones claiming it is prophecy, the Christian side, to go first. With that, Jonathan Sheffield, I understand that you'll be going first. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. We could just bring up my slides, and then as soon as I start,
Sure
if
thing.
you can start the count.
Sure thing. We'll bring up the slides, Jonathan, and your 20 minutes begins at your first word.
Profer is the first recorded critic of the Book of Daniel. According to Jerome, Profer wrote his 12th book against the prophecy of Daniel, denying that it was composed by the person ascribed in its title. Instead, he asserted that it was penned by an unnamed individual living in Judea at the time of Antiochus. Profer went on to allege that Daniel did not foretell the future so much as he relayed the past. Finally, he asserted that whatever the author spoke of up until the time of Antiochus contained authentic history, whereas anything he may have conjectured beyond that point was false, as he would not have foreknown the future. By way of rejoinder, we can empirically test Profer's allegations by walking through the legal framework to identify and date textual artifacts from antiquity. Therefore, in building our case for the traditional 6th century BC dating of Daniel, let us factor in the following empirical observations. First, the process whereby a common text comes into being is the byproduct of a certain individual or group of individuals at a certain time in a certain place. Second, in the ancient world, the physical formation, distribution, and transmission of a common text resulted in lasting echoes of extrinsic evidence. Given the Book of Daniel that is common among the Jews was not created ex nihilo, it would naturally leave behind archival fingerprints that we can examine. For in a similar manner, we come to knowledge of another textual work of antiquity of the same period, the production of the Homeric text under the Archon of Athens Pisistratus, elicited subsequent reports by Diognetus Strax, Cicero, and others of the text formation and distribution throughout Athenian society, thus enabling us to trace the publication back to its 6th century BC origin. This showcases how even at this early point in history, material traces of such endeavors were meticulously recorded. As to the ascertainment of authorship for a common text, the great bishop of Hippo, Augustine, demonstrates the procedural precedent employed among the ancients. He states, "How do we know the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and other similar writers? How is the authorship ascertained in each case, except by the author having brought his work into public notice as much as possible during his own lifetime? And where is evidence for the fact to be found, but in the information possessed by some at the time, and then transmitted by them through successive generations, even to distant times? If we apply Augustine's historically relevant criterion to the book of Daniel, we will see that the self-same investigative principles will provide the threads of evidence, pointing us back to Daniel as the rightful author. Applying the first element to our investigation, we ask, is there evidence of an esteemed figure named Daniel by the 6th century BC that is consistent with the figure mentioned in the book of Daniel? Yes, a person of interest has been identified. Ezekiel, a contemporary of the period situated in Babylon, refers to a person known as Daniel on 3 separate occasions, along with 2 known prophets in the Jewish canon. Now, the works of Josephus are of great importance for the ensuing part of our investigation, because he wrote about 2 precise areas from which we seek information: the Jewish histories and its canon. Towards the conclusion of the Antiquities, Josephus asserts that in writing this work, he performed a great feat that no one, whether they be Jew or Gentile, could emulate, of issuing so accurate a treatise for the Greek world. First, it is crucial to be mindful of the fact that when Josephus was about to write the history of the Jews, he was not only obliged to look for information dealing with the events of his own native country, but also have regard to such sources as had the general affairs of the Egyptian, Babylonian, Greek, Syrian, and Roman empires for their object. Josephus impressed upon his readers that the Antiquities were written for a Greek and Roman audience, which subjects his reports to criticism among the ruling class. As Dr. Carrier has stated, the masses were often gullible, yet educated elites reading books like Josephus typically were not. Second, Josephus prided himself on the accuracy of his Histographia, boldly claiming that the Greeks and Romans would not find a more accurate account of the Jewish histories than in his works. Josephus reminded his readers that his recounting of the Jewish war had received the approval of Titus and Vespasian, and that he regularly conferred with Julius Archelaus, Herod, and Agrippa II, all men who had borne testimony that Josephus had demonstrated the strictest regard for the truth. In the modern day, even Dr. Richard Carrier recognizes that a lot of Josephus's history checks out, and it has corroboration and reliable sourcing. He also notes that Josephus names and describes the merits of numerous sources for his histories and mentions some of the reliable written sources that he used, such as Nicholas of Damascus, a reputable court historian and friend of Herod the Great. In Book 1 against Apion, Josephus provides historically significant testimony certifying that the Jewish canon was closed by 424 BC. He numbers the book of Daniel among its contents, emphasizing the prophets recorded the events in their own period, not after. Furthermore, Josephus confirms that authoritative writings ceased since the reign of Artaxerxes, and how firmly the Jewish nation has given credit to its canon is evident by its actions. For during the passage of so many ages, no one has been so bold as to add or take anything away from it. If the Jews were so inclined to add a work to their canon after the time of Artaxerxes, it would have been strange to publish a seemingly insignificant account of an interpreter of dreams. Instead, any addition would have certainly involved the history of the Maccabees, portraying their epic struggle against the Secludians that marked one of the most important military campaigns since the time of David. Despite the importance of the event, which is still commemorated during Hanukkah, this was never added to the Jewish canon. Whereas it was included in the Septuagint, demonstrating evidence of the unchanging legitimacy of the Jewish canon. Moreover, Josephus surveyed the publications since the time of Artaxerxes, but reported those writings were unworthy of equal credit with the earlier records, because there's not been an exact succession of the prophets since that time. A report corroborated by Jerome from the Jews during his translation of the Hebrew canon into Latin. Therefore, any new works from that period would have been precluded. Additionally, Orthodox Jews would have considered it blasphemy to alter their canon after the reign of Artaxerxes by virtue of their superstition. They believed the Holy Spirit was withdrawn after the last prophets of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, a belief witnessed throughout rabbinic literature inside and outside the Talmud, demonstrating widespread belief, not private opinion. Evidence of exceptional consequence is also found in Josephus' Antiquities, which detail the public presentation of Daniel in 332 to the Macedonian king Alexander. The meaning is corroborated on a vast number of fronts in the Jewish Scroll of Fasting, Babylonian Talmud, Pseudo-Calentices, and the writings of Origen and Eusebius. Not only does Josephus' report fits the historical conditions of the period, but it also presents the simplest explanation as to why Alexander did not take Jerusalem, just as Josephus' report of Cyrus's reading of Isaiah explains why the Jews were spared and allowed to rebuild their temple and city walls. For the record, Arian confirms that the area known as Syrian Palestine, that is Israel, had accepted Alexander's control. And elsewhere, Alexander, speaking before his men at Opus, enumerated Palestine among the areas that he secured tribute from. Evidence a deal had been reached with the Jews. Further evidence of this kind is found in Josephus' citation of Hectaeus of Edapta, a contemporary of Alexander and Ptolemy, who attests the Jews went as auxiliaries along with King Alexander, another element cited in Josephus' record. Josephus report that Alexander made haste to go up to Jerusalem from Gaza as previously promised due to the Jews' refusal to send auxiliaries and supplies for his siege of Tyre is consistent with the Roman historian Rufus's record that Alexander at Gaza went out to those cities which had refused to submit to him. While Egypt presented Alexander with numerous splendors like the national treasuries and the title of Pharaoh, what could the Jews, allies of the Persians, based in the strategic military high ground, give the king after denying his request to spare its capital? The answer is clear. Josephus affirms the book of Daniel was shown to him, where Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, and Alexander believed he was that person. Alexander would not have offended a god who he had felt predicted his victories. Arian and Plutarch attest that Alexander believed he was of divine origin, and his men even criticized him for adopting foreign gods. With that, I cede my time over to Dr. Boyce.
And I'll start whenever he pulls up my slides as well, Samuel.
Yeah, we'll pause the clock until that happens. All right.
Right. So I'm going to pick up where Jonathan left off and look at the era of the time where some have alleged the book of Daniel would have been written in the middle parts of the 2nd century. So let's take a look at the witnesses of that time. Would they have ever seen something like this take place? Let's consider first Maccabees at the beginning of this. Note what it says in chapter 2, and there's this long section from verse 51 to 60, and I condensed it for time. He says, call to remembrance what acts of our fathers did in their time, or literally in their days. He goes through this long list. He mentions Abraham and David, all the way down to Elijah or Elias for being zealous and fervent for the law. He was taken up in heaven. And then he mentions 4 important figures, Ananias, Azarias, and Mishael, which is their Hebrew names. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was their names given to them once they came to Babylon. By believing were saved out of the flame, going to Daniel chapter 3. Daniel, for his innocency, was delivered from the mouth of lions, the story of Daniel in the lion's den. So here's something that we need to understand about the Maccabees, which is around that time of the 2nd century. They saw these 4 men as fathers who acted in this manner in their days, not as companions or contemporaries of their time in the Maccabean period, but rather these men existed at a specific period of time, and they did these heroic acts, and they were seen equal to that of Elijah and David and Abraham. They were held in such high regard. Another section to consider in First Maccabees was this time in chapter 9 when they're dealing with the great tribulation that was hitting them. They're fighting through this in the middle of war. It says, this great tribulation in Israel, like of which has not been since the time of the prophets, ceased to appear from among them. And this goes back to what Jonathan was saying in his presentation. The overall belief throughout was that the prophets had ceased. At that very point, it was at an end. And later in First Maccabees chapter 14, and the Jews and their priests had consented that he, and this is Simon Maccabeus, should be their prince and high priest forever until there should arise a faithful prophet. Once more, again, in the First Maccabees, they're not considering new revelation to be coming. They're not considering new prophecy to be coming. And so they would have seen anybody raising themselves up to be a prophet or to write on behalf of God or to be a part of a canonical collection. They would have rejected that in their day. And we have to understand the Maccabee family was that of the priesthood. These are the high priest times. And so they raised up Simon, one of the sons, to be not only the prince, but the high priest forever until there should arise a faithful prophet, which they believed was the one that would come promised by Malachi. And so they did not believe a prophet had arisen. And if there was going to be any transmission of a text, they would have been knowing, they would have been in the know, and they would have been a part of actually collecting that, which we'll see in a minute. Another one that needs to be considered is the Talmud, for example. The Talmud in 2 different sections, you have in the Amma 1:9, it says, Abba said, refers of Bath Kol, as we have taught in the following Beretha. With the death of the last prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the prophetic spirit was withdrawn from Israel. So here's the people of the time, the Jewish understanding of their heritage, writing commentary of what took place. And they recognized the spirit of prophecy was taken from Israel, and it ended at the time of the writings of Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, which was in the return from exile. And then they said later also in the Bavra Batra in 15, and thus the book of Daniel, which was in exile. So here's something you need to recognize, that Daniel was not just a historical figure to them. He was writing a book which was in exile. And thus the scroll of Esther and the 12, which prophecies were minor, that would be the minor prophets, did not write it together, but rather, catch the phrase, each wrote their own book. So he's not only alleging here in the Talmud that Daniel wrote a book, but that he wrote his own book, that he was the author of that writing, and that Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi came and saw that the Holy Spirit was withdrawing, that they were the last prophets. So they have just a wealth of information here from Jewish heritage, belief systems spread out. You have Josephus, you have the Talmud, you have the Maccabeans recognizing the spirit of prophecy was gone. Later, after this time period, not far after, in the book of 2nd Baruch 85, you see this attested to as well. Further, know that our fathers in former times and former generations had helpers, righteous prophets of the Kadesh men. But now the righteous have been assembled and the prophets are sleeping. They recognize the prophets are no longer around. They are dead. They did not involve themselves in new works on behalf of the Holy Spirit. They believed in that closing of the canon. Also consider 2nd Maccabees. I think this is important to understanding how in this time frame a book would have been recognized, canonized, or placed within a collection that they would have approved of either by commentary or canon. This family was duplicating what was done in the time of the exile and their return of the days of Nehemiah. Consider chapter 2, verse 13. And these same things were set down in the memoirs and commentaries of Nehemiah, and how he made a library and gathered together out of the countries the books, both the prophets, which they have already categorically placed Daniel, and David and the epistles of the kings concerning the holy gifts.
And in like manner, Judas, this is Judas Maccabeus, also gathered together all such things. So you have Judas Maccabeus, who is a part of this priestly line. In the middle of war, what would take place is there would be a collection of the books. They would take these books in. Any commentaries, lineages were very important when you read Ezra chapter 2, when you're Nehemiah chapter 7, when you're looking at the books that they go into in the Old Testament in times of war or conflict. They're collecting their data from their canon and what they call scripture and prophets, any kind of lineages they can trace their bloodlines to, any commentaries of what took place of historicity, they collect them and put them together. And that's what they're saying Nehemiah did in the return of exile. And in like manner, in times of war during the Maccabean times, they too, with Judas Maccabeus, gathered all of these same books, all such things, the prophets, David, the epistles of the kings, and they collected anything they had so that they would not be lost, because wartime usually produces destruction, burnings, and you lose what's happening. So if there were to be a book written in the middle of the 2nd century, the Maccabean family would have been fully aware of it. And if they had alleged themselves to be a writer under the description of Daniel, they would have had to approve such a work into this collection of library where they were preserving in the time of war that which was spoken of in the prophets and David and the epistles of the kings, the Torah, and all that they learned from their history and lineages. This would have been overly alarming to them because they would have seen it as an imposter. They would have called it out. The Jews nor the church have had any issue in history at calling out forgeries, recognizing mistakes, recognizing perversions. And so we see that here. Also consider once more Josephus, as we've already heard. So it was said the temple was made desolate by Antiochus and continued for 3 years. And in this desolation came to pass according to the prophecy of Daniel, which was given 408 years before. For he declared that some of the Macedonians would dissolve that worship for some time. And this is in the Antiquities of the Jews. So Josephus recognized Daniel was a prophet. He had predicted these things 408 years before. He had already recognized the closing of the canon. That closing of the canon is consistent with the Talmud. It is consistent with First Maccabees. It's consistent with how canonization would have been recognized. It's consistent in Second Maccabees, looking at Judas Maccabeus and how he would have built this library like unto Nehemiah. He would have only allowed that which was accepted as prophecy, which they have already as a family established, ended at the time of Malachi, ended at the time of Zechariah and Haggai. One last thing to consider in closing. 2 manuscripts in the Qumran family, known recently to the name of Midrash of Eschatology. This is an interesting collection of those at Qumran in the 50 to 80 BC era, in that time, 30-year frame perhaps. They're looking for signs of the Messiah. They go through Deuteronomy 18. They look at 2 Samuel 7, the Psalms of what they say about the Messiah, Hosea's prophecies. And oddly enough, they mention also the book of Daniel in light of the resurrection. Up to this point, the prophecies have been received unto 11 chapters compiled within the fragments of Qumran. The 12th chapter is missing in the Qumran fragments, but not in the commentary section like this. In fact, you see a commentary of Daniel chapter 12 in relation to the coming Messiah and the resurrection. So they obviously had chapter 12. It was not some Greek tradition that brought in the mythology of resurrection. Rather, they were doing commentary of what was already existed. It ought to be noted that the phrasing in one of these fragments is this: it is written in the book of Daniel, the prophet. What does that mean? What does that mean for us? What should we consider around the time of 50 to 80 BC? Those at Qumran and their scribes were not penning a new work or transmitting current modern work. Rather, they were considering the book of Daniel a written text and that he was a prophet. This was not a contemporary work they were recognizing. They were continuing this transmission and giving it commentary equal to Deuteronomy 18's prophecy of Messiah, 2 Samuel 7, Psalms and Hosea and other works like Isaiah. They were considering Daniel's work equal to its validation of prophecy of Messiah's coming. And we find that in this little bit of fragment we have left of the commentary of the Midrash of Eschatology.
And time. Thank you for that, Dr. Stephen Boyce and Jonathan Sheffield. You guys ate into the additional 1 minute. With that, thank you very much for your opening statements. We go over to the atheist side. Dr. Josh Bowen and Jim Majors, you would have 20 minutes as well in your opening statement. I'll give you a little bit of time in the transition between the first and second speaker. And like they did, you would have an additional 1 minute if you do cross time. So your 20 minutes starts at your first word.
All right. Well, I will start and get my stuff out of the way because Jim is the real expert here. So the dating of the book of Daniel is one of the battleground topics for many Christians and apologists. The book purports to be written by Daniel in the 6th century BCE and predicts events from the following centuries. The consensus of biblical scholars today, however, is that the book was not composed in the 6th century, but was compiled at a much later date in the 2nd century BCE. Here, I will focus on 3 points that strongly suggest a late date of writing: vague and sometimes inaccurate early historical events, specific and accurate later events, and the final kingdom as presented in the book, Greece. The overall argument that I will make is as follows. Descriptions of earlier events tend to be more vague and to contain historical inaccuracies. Conversely, the later events are described in much greater detail and accuracy. This fits well with the 2nd century composition of the book. Finally, the visions of chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10 through 12 vary in specificity, but all describe the final earthly kingdom as Greece, stated specifically in 2 of the visions. If the kingdom of Greece is the final kingdom to exist before the coming kingdom of God, this strongly indicates that the visions were not predicting some time in the distant future, but rather that the end would come in the 2nd century BCE. This accords well with the 2nd century writing. Let's begin by briefly covering some of the early historical problems with the book. For most of the following issues, apologists have argued for possible solutions, however unlikely they may be. Often, however, we are simply left with, well, isn't it possible that? First, Daniel reports a siege of Jerusalem in Jehoiakim's 3rd year, which would be 606 or 605, an event for which we have no evidence, which we would expect to see in the Babylonian Chronicle. Second, scholars agree that the madness of Nebuchadnezzar is the result of attributing a tradition about Nabonidus, the crazy king who spent 10 years away from Babylonia, to Nebuchadnezzar. This is supported by the text from Qumran, the prayer of Nabonidus, which parallels the story about Nebuchadnezzar. Third, the figure of Belshazzar, son of Nebuchadnezzar, presents numerous problems. For example, he was not Nebuchadnezzar's son, and he was not in command when Babylonia fell to Cyrus. Finally, I will mention Darius the Mede, a ruler for which we have no historical evidence. Not only is there no evidence, but we actually know who was ruling at the time when Darius was said to have been in power. In short, from the period in which Daniel was purported to have lived, he got many of the historical details wrong. However, in Daniel 11, we see that details from the later period, the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, were far more specific and accurate. Following a description of Alexander the Great and the Diadochoi, we see in verses 5 through 8, the king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger, and he will rule his own kingdom with great power. After some years, they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she will not retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days, she will be betrayed, together with her royal court and her father and the one who supported her. One from her family line will arise and take her place. He will attack the forces of the king of the north and enter his fortress. He will fight against them and be victorious. He will also seize their gods, their metal images, and their valuable articles of silver and gold, and carry them off to Egypt. For some years, he will leave the king of the north alone. The events described here are those concerning Ptolemy I and Seleucus I. The latter joined the former as a general to fight off Antigonus. However, after Antigonus died in 301, Seleucus the first became more powerful than Ptolemy the first. About 50 years later, Ptolemy II attempted to reconcile with the Seleucids by marrying off Berenice to Antiochus II. However, this ultimately backfired, and Berenice, her son, her Egyptian servants, and her father all died. Berenice's brother, Ptolemy III, attacked Antiochus II and carried off plunder. There was then 2 years without conflict between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. From these verses alone, you can see that the events describing the 3rd and 2nd centuries, just before the book is agreed to have been compiled, are far more detailed and accurate. Finally, the earthly kingdom described in chapters 7, 8, and 10 to 12 is Greece. The text anticipates that during the time of the Greek Empire, under a ruler that will bring about desolations, removal of the daily sacrifice, and utter turmoil to the people, the end would come, ushering in the reign of God's heavenly kingdom. This, of course, fits perfectly with not only a 2nd century composition of Daniel, but with the overall purpose of the book. As an apocalyptic text, its goal is to explain the evil in the world and to encourage the faithful to remain so for just a little while longer, as deliverance was just around the corner. In conclusion, I would like to illustrate what I consider to be a fundamental problem in the debate on the dating of Daniel, beginning with a conclusion. In the publication of his dissertation, Stephen Anderson, not that Stephen Anderson, writes, quote, "Most importantly, Daniel was a prophet who wrote infallibly under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, whereas extra-biblical sources for the life of Cyrus are ordinary human writings. Since God was speaking through Daniel as he wrote, the book of Daniel is not to be viewed as an account of uncertain trustworthiness, whose veracity is to be judged by other data, but rather must be the standard by which all other accounts are measured," end quote. Concerning this type of fundamentalist approach, which is often mirrored in many aspects in Christian apologetics, Lester Graber writes, quote, "Fundamentalism has already determined its conclusions. It is not seeking because it already knows the answer. If it has good evidence on its side which supports the Bible, it uses it. If it has little data, it twists and interprets what it has to support the Bible. If it has no evidence, it hypothesizes that such will eventually be found. And of course, no amount of contrary evidence is sufficient. Fundamentalism can never conclude that the Bible is wrong." With that, I turn it over to Jim.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Josh. Awesome. Thanks for breaking that ice. So as Dr. Josh said, when it comes to the highly contested origins of the book of Daniel, there are two major views. You have the traditionalist view or the conservative view, and the critical scholar view or the liberal view. The traditionalist view regarding the dating of Daniel is the same as that which the book seems to claim, that it is a 6th century BCE text written by an exiled Jewish official in Babylon who is predicting events that are not fulfilled until the 2nd century BCE and later. The critical scholars view, nearly unanimously held by scholars who study the book of Daniel, widely view the book of Daniel as a redacted compilation of a collection of early court tales from the late Persian and early Hellenistic period. This would be chapters 1 through 6 in the book of Daniel that you know today, and later editions of visions that were written in the 2nd century BCE, which you would know as chapters 7 through 12, the second half. Most critical scholars see the book of Daniel as a text that came about to encourage Jews under Antiochian persecution during the 2nd century BCE, to help them and encourage them to continue being faithful to their God and to obey their traditional rules and uphold their traditional values, despite the pressure to assimilate to a more Hellenized form of Judaism. This period of Hellenization in the region began with the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE, and the Hellenization spread until much past the 2nd century BCE. But 2nd century BCE, you could say that Hellenization was at its height in the history of Judaism. Many traditionalists, mainly Christian apologists, often accuse critical scholars of taking a naturalistic approach to their dating methods and claiming supernatural occurrences such as divinely delivered prophecy to be impossible. And if you've heard that, then hear this. critical scholars are allowed to believe in the supernatural. This may seem like a shocker, but while many scholars don't believe the supernatural exists, many do. However, critical scholars in the fields such as history and archaeology, whether a believer or not, use methodology that relies on an unbiased view of culture and religion and makes no assumption as to the validity of supernatural elements of their subjects of study. So many critical scholars are simply believers who have set aside their theological presuppositions and approach the text like they would any other. If critical scholars, even believers, were to take Daniel to be completely true at face value, then they'd have to accept as truth the writings of every other alleged prophet, seer, and oracle, regardless of the faith. And as you can imagine, this could lead to more than a few difficulties. When critical scholars analyze the book of Daniel from an unbiased perspective, including many of those who hold a personal belief in divine prophecy, they do not see a 6th century text that's accurately predicting the next 2,500 plus years. They see a 2nd century redaction of 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th century BCE texts that poorly predict the next few years. This is a position that is reached by first examining the historical, then the theological, and then the literary nature of the book of Daniel. In other words, it is a conclusion that is come to by examining the evidence, and it's not an assumption made before doing so. One such person that does this is the late Robert Henry Pfeiffer, a Protestant Bible scholar and Assyriologist who taught at Harvard University from 1922 after serving as a Methodist minister from 1916 to 1919. And in his introduction to the Old Testament, one of the greatest commentaries of the early 20th century, in his commentary on the book of Daniel, he writes, quote, "Historical research can deal only with authenticated facts, which are within the sphere of natural possibilities, and must refrain from vouching for the truth of supernatural events." End quote. When critical scholars analyze the book of Daniel, they think to themselves, if this text was authored in the 6th century BCE, we would expect that the historical content of the text would support that claim. You would expect that if the author of Daniel was writing during the Babylonian exile or shortly thereafter, that he would be aware of cultural and political happenings in the area. But that's not at all the case. Traditionalists claim that the book of Daniel was written by a Jew who personally witnessed and experienced the fall of Jerusalem, life under Neo-Babylonian rule, and the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But as Dr. Josh has already pointed out, it's clear that the author doesn't know who the king of Jerusalem was when it fell, Jehoiachin, not Jehoiakim, who the king of Babylon was when Babylon fell, Nabonidus, not Belshazzar, who the kings between Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus are. Daniel doesn't seem to know of Amel Marduk, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, Neriglissar, Labashi Marduk, and he doesn't seem to know when Jerusalem fell. It was in 598 BCE, not 606 or 605. And he doesn't seem to know when Babylon fell, because he doesn't even know who Babylon fell to, the event that would be closest to the time of the alleged authorship in the 6th century. So if the traditionalist view is correct, then these are all events and people that the author of Daniel would know. Yet we see the author constantly and consistently making mistakes when talking about his own life in exile. He can't tell you common facts about the 6th century world that he lives in, but some people believe that he can predict the future. When it comes to prophecy, prophecy is not just a prediction of history. It is not ex eventu. Prophecy is, it had a present meaning for those people in the context that it's presented in, for the audience that it is delivered to. Not to somebody thousands of years later. Prophecy's main component is its predictive power. Daniel is supposed to be a prophecy of Jesus coming back thousands of years later, according to most Christians. But for some reason, the author of Daniel isn't aware of any kingdom after Greece. Doesn't make sense. We do not have any evidence outside of the Bible of a deportation which took place during the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, which was in 607, 606. The first capture of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar II was in 598 or 597. And like I said, it was during the reign of the son of Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin. So this is something that Daniel would have been present for, whenever Jerusalem was taken over, this would be a huge memory as a young man, as a teenager, the city being invaded. It's highly unlikely that he would forget who the king was. Many cuneiform documents have been found in catalog that are dated to the beginning of the Babylonian exile and beyond, and later than that. And there's even one mentioning the name of Jehoiachin that's internally dated to 592 BCE. All these tablets, over 100, show Jehoiachin continued to be regarded as the legitimate king of Judah. He was given special treatment reflecting his position while he was in captivity, such as like eating with the king or eating the king's food, not only by Nebuchadnezzar, but by his successors as well. And you can also see that in 2 Kings 25, verse 27 through 30, and in Jeremiah 52, verses 31 through 34. And it's clear that Daniel is talking about Antiochus. It's what everything is boiling down to. All these historical points end at Antiochus, such as the little horn in Daniel 8:9. It says that talks about the host being given over, and together with the regular burnt offering, and that the regular burnt offering, that there would be a transgression that would make it desolate. That would force the sanctuary to be given over and the host to be trampled. And it says, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. Well, First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, there are so many texts that talk about Antiochus doing this. Josephus says Antiochus IV built an idol altar on God's altar and slew swine on it, that he sacrificed pigs on it, which would most certainly make a Jewish altar desolate. And the erection of the idol altar, whenever you see references to abominations in the Old Testament, they can nearly always be understood as heathen gods, idols depicting heathen gods, offerings to heathen gods, or anything associated with the worship of foreign gods was called an abomination. Daniel 9, the 70 weeks, which is the prophecy that I think we're going to end up, that I thought was going to be on everybody's mind coming into this. To quote George Peters, a Lutheran minister, he said, "It has been well observed by various writers that if the 70 weeks are to end with the death of Christ and the incoming destruction of Jerusalem, it is simply impossible, with all ingenuity expended in this direction by eminent men, to make out an accurate fulfillment of prophecy from the dates given, for the time usually adduced being either too long to fit with the crucifixion of Christ or too short to extend to the destruction of Jerusalem." In Jewish eschatology, the end days had certain events that were to transpire. God was to redeem the Jewish people from their captivity, a second Exodus, if you will. God was to return them back to their homeland of Israel. He was to restore the house of David and rebuild the temple. He was to create a ruler on earth, a regent, a co-regent of God, if you will, from the house of David that was understood as a Messiah, to lead the Jews into a new age, into a messianic age, an age of peace.
2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. That all nations would recognize that the God of Israel is the only God and come to worship it. And that God would resurrect the dead, and then he would create this new heaven and a new earth. So if there was any variation in any of those, amongst the Jewish sects, it was very few, but most, this is how what the standard Jewish eschatology looked like as far as the end of days. In Daniel 9, you have a prophecy that is broken down that says, going forth the word to restore and build, and then 7 weeks. So you have one period of 7 weeks. You have a period of 62 weeks, time of trouble when the city is supposed to be rebuilt. And
1 minute.
There's supposed to be a coming of an anointed ruler. And finally, in the third, you have a cutting off of an anointed one. And this ruler, his forces desolating the city, and this ruler making a pact with the many. And then you have another half a week, and then you have a stop that has come to the offering because of an abomination of desolation that is installed in the sanctuary. Then another half week, and then a decree to the coming ruler, and an end to sin, and Jerusalem's desolations, and the eternal righteousness, yay, blah, blah, blah. So there's clearly two different anointed ones here, and there's 62 weeks, or 434 years apart. Daniel's interest in this prophecy is clearly focused on this last division, specifically this last half of the 70 weeks of years. And like Dr. Josh said, the message essentially is that the end of their suffering is near, that the time that's left is nothing compared to the time that's already passed. So the decree is coming soon. They'll be all right. In Daniel 9:25, it speaks of a decree being issued. And that's clearly the edict of Cyrus, which allowed the temple to be rebuilt.
30 seconds.
How many?
30 seconds left. This is in your extra time.
Oh, okay. But essentially, there's no reason, no justification for ignoring these clear divisions. Christian interpreters avoid having to identify them separately, and they do this by combining the first period of 7 weeks with the second period of 62 weeks. And there's many problems with that, but yeah, long story short, Daniel was written in the 2nd century BCE, and used older 4th, 5th, 6th century text to make up the first 6 chapters. And with that, I give up whatever seconds I have.
No, you've crossed it by 2 seconds. So,
okay, sorry.
No, that's all right. I think the boat. Thank you very much, Dr. Josh.
I actually think that's the first time I've used all of my time for an opening statement.
Well, I'm really grateful to both you, Jim, and also to Dr. Josh for your opening statements as well. And yes, the fact that both sides used both of their extra time as well. I'm glad we had that 1 minute extra time. We won't be doing that in the rebuttal period, though. So now we go to the rebuttal period, and both sides have 10 minutes each between the two speakers to respond to what the other side said in the opening statement. And I will highly ask both sides that you would kindly respond to what the other side said in the opening statements, and not maybe something else outside of them. So with that, to the Christian side, Dr. Stephen Boyce and Jonathan Sheffield, your 10 minutes starts at your first word.
Okay, so I'm probably going to address 3 points that came from Dr. Josh and Mr. Majors. First, I want to bring up their appeal to the consensus, or their appeal to the critical scholarship. Now, despite that we provided ample evidence from Josephus and other historians weighing in favor of a 6th century BC dating, we are up against a worldview, or this consensus, which is sort of this Enlightenment era worldview that is dismissive of the Jewish histories. Now, Josephus was plagued by a related situation in his day, because the prototype of this worldview that we're coming up against today with the consensus actually originated with those Greeks who felt that the Jewish histories were unworthy for consideration, and thereby did not believe Josephus's former accounts of the very ancient date of the Jewish nation. Josephus reported that he cannot greatly wonder at those men who suppose that we must attend to none but Grecians when we're inquiring about the most ancient facts, and must inform ourselves of their truth and from them only, while we must not believe ourselves or other men. For it's an absurd thing for the Greeks to vaunt themselves to be the only people that are acquainted with antiquity and have delivered the true accounts of those early times. In face of such a worldview, Josephus stated that he would not be led by vain opinions, but will make inquiry after truth from the facts themselves. And this is what we're trying to do as well. Now, Dr. Josh did bring up about Darius the Mede. He did bring some attention to it. So once again, we do have an account from Daniel that does cite a person as Darius, okay? Now, we also have corroboration from Josephus. We do have an ancient historian that was published in an anti-Jewish time that basically said, but when Babylon was taken by Darius, and when he, with his kinsman Cyrus, had put an end to the dominion of the Babylonians, he was 62 years old. He was the son of Arstartes and had another name among the Greeks. So we do have an ancient historian that had access to the sources, who was publishing in an anti-Jewish time, that made this claim, which is important. Now, another thing that Mr. Majors had brought up is regarding the Joachim, hopefully that's correct, Mr. Majors, but Jerome already addressed this in his response to Profer in the 4th century. And what Jerome says is, let no one therefore imagine that the Joachim in the beginning of Daniel is the same person as the one who is spelled Joachim in the commencement of Ezekiel. For the latter has chin as its final syllable, whereas the former has kim. As is for this reason, in the gospel according to Matthew, there seems to be a generation missing because of the second group of 14 extending to the time of Joachim, ends with the son of Josiah. And the third group begins with Joachim, the son of Joachim. Being ignorant of this fact, Profer formulated a slander against the church, which only revealed his ignorance. And another thing that we do need to address is the historicity question. Now, one of the points that Jerome is relaying from Profer's argument, and Profer was being educated at Athens, the student of Polonius, he was well acquainted with the history, but one of the things that he said is Profer didn't really have any issues with the historicity. Someone who was from Tyre, educated at Athens, did not make all these said that there was problems with the history for the most part. Profer, according to Jerome, said the history up until the time was correct. It's anything afterwards this period was conjured up. So with that part, I would like to cede my remaining time to Dr. Boyce.
Tell me when, Samuel.
Yep. As soon as, yeah, you can go in now. Yeah.
Okay. To kind of go into some of what Jonathan had said, and I really appreciate the time and demonstrations by both Jim and Josh is really good. I actually enjoyed, Jim, I learned some things of your arguments I actually never heard on the other end admit. So I found that interesting, but I find that you trying to be fair too. So I appreciate the list there. One thing that Dr. Josh brought up that I would address as well, as you mentioned that the conservative or fundamentalists and their presupposition forces them to twist and make things true that are false and false that are true. And I think that we would all agree that criteria exists and that type of thinking does exist in the Christian world. And I think that Jonathan and myself would greatly oppose that consistency of just make it true because you want it to be true thinking. I don't think that's how we examine anything. I know that one of the things that there is a push in Christian scholarship is to leave as many presuppositions at home. One of the statements made with Dr. Jim Majors as well was that critical scholars have unbiased opinion in their historicity. I don't know of any scholar that has some level or has no level of bias at all. We all have some level of bias. We all go into it with a worldview. We all go into it with a bias. We want to and try to and make it a practice to leave our biasnesses at the door. But even in that process, we all have a worldview. We just can't leave at the door. So I would say that there is no argument that makes one or the other right on the basis of presuppositions. We all have them. But I will say this, I appreciate both in critical scholarship, liberal and conservative scholarship, that there is a push in this generation that's speaking today to get to the bottom of the truth and find the source of truth, whether that be through the scripture, historical arguments, archaeological discoveries,
history and its lineages and giving us the words that we're talking about today. It's a blessing. We have more information in this group than most generations have ever had before, and I think we should use that wisely. Going into this idea of consensus, with that being said, the consensus always changes. And I'm only 31 years old, and I know that when it comes to consensus on little small things, even in scholarship amongst Christian communities, or even the unbelieving world, the atheistic world, whatever you want to label, the consensus changes regularly. The consensus of scholarship at the earliest points, which has been in the demonstration of Jonathan and myself, the consensus was settled and unwavered, including to places where Profer was involved in this. He's the only one that went against consensus at his time. But as Jonathan demonstrated, his issue is not with the historicity, but rather with the text. You had different ideas coming in, Bell and Dragon. You had the songs of the Jewish boys. You had Susanna. These different stories coming in. He was fighting the Theodosian text. And so when Jerome was combating him, he was looking at it from that perspective. So even though he opposed the timing of Daniel based on really linguistics, the text that he was doing it from was not the text that we are arguing from today. He was using a Theodosian text, and Jerome had combated him. And Eusebius did as well. Unfortunately, we don't have his volumes that dealt with that. Now, one of the interesting things that I would point out with the discussion is when we're talking about first, second Maccabees, for example, Dr. Jim brought up first, second Maccabees. Though there are things there with Antiochus that are mentioned, they have set also in those same books the criteria for acceptance. This was the family that was really canonizing a collection of the canonizing sections through their high priestly positions, to the point where Simon was given the rule of prince and high priest forever till a prophet would come, and that they had collected in the like manner of Nehemiah these books. They too would have considered any biblical text of writing that came into the equation. Anything that was done under the name of prophecy would have gone through their jurisdiction. They rather placed Daniel and his writings at a later time, in an ancient time of the fathers, but not allowed it to be a part of their day. They did not see it as contemporary. So when we're talking about Darius, there are possibilities. Xenophon, or whether we're talking about the Josephus's opinion, they had guys that they marked that they assumed would have been this guy
30 seconds.
under different names, under different aliases, or whatever that may be. The key that we're looking for in the middle of the 2nd century would be, where are the potential candidates? Who could have written a book like this, or collected older texts in the first 6 chapters, brought in modern ideas, Hellenistic worldviews, compiled this text, put it into circulation without the acknowledgement of those who were in charge, the Maccabean family. These men had no knowledge of this. We see that when we come to Qumran, we end up in the same situation. The scholars at Qumran were completely...
All right, we're going to call time on this one, Stephen. Unfortunately, I hate to cut you off, but yeah, the time we've crossed time by about 10 seconds. So with that, so really sorry about that, and we will be moving over to the atheist side for your rebuttal period, your 10-minute rebuttal period. And because the Christian side did cross by 10 seconds, I'll give you guys the additional 10 seconds for that. So with that, we will begin at your first word.
Okay, do you want me to start, Dr. Josh?
Yeah, you have much more to say than I do.
So first thing, the debate's about, prophecy versus forgery. And while I believe that forgery is a strong word, prophecy is clearly the claim. But what does Daniel predict that isn't already in other canonical texts? That would be my question. And the early comparison by Jonathan to the Homeric text, I would say that they aren't the same genre as Daniel. Epics aren't the same thing as apocalypses. Sorry, I meant to thank Jonathan and Dr. Stephen Boyce so much for your introduction and your kind words. I appreciate that. So when talking about Josephus, that's one thing that I definitely want to point out. I don't know, I can't remember who mentioned it, but Josephus, mentions Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great coming to Jerusalem. And it says that he's being met by Jaddua, a high priest. But the Talmud, it presents it a little differently. It says that he was met by Simeon the Just, who would be the grandson of Jaddua, also a high priest, in a town about 40 miles northwest. So that's found that kind of funny. Jerome, addressing Jehoiakim, Jerome says that it's a code, this Jeconias, but he's only reading the Greek and the Latin. That's all that he's using. You don't have those difficulties whenever you're reading Daniel, and regardless, that's not, even if it was a code, that still doesn't fix any of the difficulties. Biases are not preventable, but certain presuppositions are preventable. The canon was definitely not closed by 424 BCE. And as far as the Maccabees gathering the text, the one who gathered them was Judas Maccabeus, and it was done in about 167 BCE. And there's no reason why the Maccabees would be against the book of Daniel, because it completely supported their cause. And the Maccabees were the force against Hellenization of Judaism. They would have definitely used it. In fact, in my dissertation, one of my main theory, and theory that I don't think is going to be rejected by very many Daniel scholars, is that it was compiled for the purpose of encouraging not only hope and some sort of something to look forward to by Jews under Antiochian persecution, but to also build and bolster this rebellion against the Hellenization of Jerusalem, against allowing the Jewish children to go to the gymnasium and to be seen naked, and Jewish men attempting to reverse their circumcisions, or not getting circumcised at all, not circumcising their male children, offering libations to a foreign god. This was something that was happening and something that was encouraged at the time. Everything that is in the book of Daniel, like in chapters 8 and chapters 11 and chapter 9, all these references are, like Dr. Josh said, the closer that it gets to the second century, towards the time of the Seleucid period, the more accurate that it gets. And as you get back through the Hellenistic and into the Persian and Babylonian periods, it gets much less accurate. So, I mean, I just would like some sort of explanation for why Daniel, if a 6th century BCE author, why he doesn't know what is going on in the 6th century BCE, the most inarguably important and most impactful events of his life. Dr. Josh?
Yeah, I mean, you can keep going. So that it's clear, like late Second Temple Judaism, and obviously 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century CE is like not my field of expertise. So, much more of what I would feel comfortable talking about would be actual, historical problems that occur in the book itself. But, yeah, I mean, I think, well, I'm not supposed to talk about what was said in the rebuttal. So I think, again, Josephus is not my expertise, and I'll stop after this and cede the rest of my time back to Jim. But like, I just wrote a book on, and one of the chapters is on the book of Daniel. And I say in the chapter, like, I'm getting ready to go into stuff that's not my field of expertise, but here I'm going to cite reputable scholars because this is what the book is all about. And I cite Peake and Green and I think Goldstein, who all talk about this this thing that both Jim and Jonathan referred to with Alexander supposedly coming to Jerusalem. And essentially, I mean, it's like there's just no question about this from a historical standpoint. Josephus is known again amongst the scholars in the field, it appears, that the earlier you go back with him, the more that he's relying on sources that maybe aren't that reliable. And then, of course, when you get into the first century, into his time, it gets more reliable. So I think taking Josephus sort of on the whole, for any historian, I think as ancient historian is problematic. Any historian is problematic. But again, not my field of expertise. So Jim, if you had a couple more things you want to talk about, that's awesome.
No, I would I kind of just blew over the whole how unreliable Josephus was seen by his not only his contemporaries but later later people who even historiographers, whenever they're studying these ancient historians and their texts, Josephus is right up there like the top 10 of like the most unreliable. But yeah, other than that, I mean, that's about it. Turn the rest of my time to I guess the Q&A, because we really don't need any more time anywhere else, I don't think.
Right. Thank you for that, Dr. Josh and Jim, for that. Now we are done with the rebuttal period. We are going to go to the cross-examinations, and we'll begin with our Christian side. May I know who will be going first for the cross-examination? Or who rather will be cross-examining the other side? Is it Stephen or Jonathan? You're muted, Jonathan.
Oh, I apologize. I guess I can go first with my questions. Sure. And I think for Dr. Josh or Dr. Major, since you're basically almost there.
Oh, no, not yet.
Shall I start the time now, Jonathan?
Oh yeah, give me 1 second. I was just going to ask them.
Go ahead.
Would you prefer me just to address a question and whoever wants to pick it up answer, or would you prefer me just to ask individually? Which would you prefer, Dr. Josh?
If I don't know it, I'm going to say, Jim, go for it. So,
okay, fair enough.
Right, and by the way, Jonathan, it's your time. You get to decide how you want to go about it. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, your time begins at your first word, Jonathan.
Okay, if historical accuracy is a measure we are applying to discredit the traditional date and authorship of Daniel, why wouldn't this measure also apply to Herodotus, Suetonius, Plutarch, or even Joseph Smith? In those cases, no one doubts that they were the authors of the work or the time when they wrote it. So why would we with Daniel?
Well,
you want a Jim?
But there are certain aspects of each of those that are questioned, whether it's the place, the people that are mentioned. So why can't Daniel be questioned about what time that it's being purported to have been written in? We wouldn't take Herodotus at his word for some of his texts, just like we wouldn't take Homer at his word for some of his texts. But both can be relied on as in certain ways that they are reliable, but can't be said to be reliable in the information that they transmit on the surface. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Next question. Since forged work or any publication requires a forger, can you provide any written source from the ancient world identifying a person of interest or a suspect for your Maccabean hypothesis, given that Josephus stated that there was a full history of the time that was available and which is still available today?
I would say that it's only by a stroke of pure luck that we even have porphyries, and it's only because it's preserved in the writings of Jerome's commentary on the Book of Daniel. many books that were that provided contrary views to the what was considered Christian Judaism or later Christianity was burned starting in about the 4th century, either burned or banned. So I mean, it's just because that's the only one that survives. I don't think that constitutes coming to the conclusion that there are no other contemporary disagreements with it.
Now, since Plutarch and Arrian composed histories of Alexander after Josephus' publication of the Antiquities, and wrote it at a time that was hostile to the Jews, given the war Hadrian was in 132, which would have welcomed the repudiation of Josephus' account of the Jews in Alexander, why don't we have a counter narrative published in the ancient world from these historians, or the families of the Ptolemies that were still around in Egypt, or the Secludians, if the report was propaganda?
Are you talking about the Book of Daniel?
Well, I'm talking about Josephus. Yeah, Josephus' account of Alexander and the Jews, or the Jews' presentation of the Book of Daniel to Alexander. Plutarch and Arrian wrote afterwards. They were writing at a very anti-Jewish time. They were court historians. It would have made it would have served them well, repudiating Josephus if this report, because Josephus was attacked on a number of things, but this account was widespread. So why don't we have any of the reports from the people that, the descendants of Alexander, the Ptolemies, the Secludians, why don't we have any reports from them who were descendants that said, hey, this is propaganda. This is crazy what they're saying.
Well, I don't know about just coming out and saying straight out propaganda, just because I don't think that at the time that Josephus's writings were really important to anybody but the Jews. I don't think that the Ptolemies, were really that interested in it, at the time that everything's going on. But I would say that the Talmud, there's a Talmudic text that mentions the exact same thing about Alexander the Great wanting to meet the high priest, and the only difference is that in the Talmud that Alexander the Great is met by the grandson of wait, let me make sure that I'm saying that right. By the grandson of Jaddua, who Josephus says that met the high priest Simeon in Jerusalem. So it gets it off by two high priests. So unless Alexander met the high priest at 2 separate times and said the same thing to the high priest 2 separate times, then there's clearly a what I would consider if not contemporary, it's contemporary enough. And then you have to get First and Second Maccabees, Second Kings. You have biblical texts that already talk about what's going on, that what Daniel's talking about, all these events that they have knowledge of.
So next question is, well, if that's all true, how do we explain that Alexander let a Persian ally did not take Jerusalem? Every ancient civilization did. The Secludians, after Alexander's death, Ptolemy went in there and seized Jerusalem. We have the Secludians, of course, another descendant. The Babylonians, the Assyrians tried to attack it. And the two accounts from two of the greatest, Cyrus the Great, who was purportedly seen a copy of Isaiah, and Josephus's account of how do we explain that in regards to why was Jerusalem spared and no one else was?
I I really don't know the answer to that. There are many positive answers. I think it'd be good if maybe like if Plutarch gave us a definitive answer of why Jerusalem was spared. But unfortunately, I believe all that we have are just Jewish narratives, and they all differ. Whether they're from with their Samaritan text or Midrash or Talmud. There's a lot of different traditions as to what happened, when it happened, and who it happened with. I really don't know the answer to that as far as what happened historically. Dr. Josh, what do you think?
Certainly not my period.
How much time do I have left?
You have you have 2 minutes, 20 seconds.
Now, I know we haven't really gone through this much, but I would just like to ask a question on linguistics, if that's okay. Now, since the linguistic profiles of text that we have Daniel may not be that of the original author due to modernization of language over time, just as probably the text of Homer that came down to Cicero and we have today may not represent profile from Pisistratus, but maybe a closer time of Alexandria where they did a lot of editing. Why would a linguistic approach offer more reliable testimony than that of Josephus and the Jews on the dating of Daniel?
Sorry, what was the last part?
Why would a linguistic approach offer more reliable testimony to dating Daniel than testimony from Josephus and the Jews on the date?
As far as the book of Daniel is concerned, it's my quote unquote expert opinion that the linguistic arguments alone are not enough to date the book of Daniel. So I don't think that the linguistic arguments are the strongest arguments for a later date.
Okay.
Guys, you have 1 minute left.
I think that's it. I'll go ahead and cede my time to Dr. Boyce.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, for that cross-examination. We will pass the time to Dr. Stephen Boyce. Or would you guys prefer if you go 1-1 and then bounce back? Do you have a preference in that?
No, he can go ahead. That's fine. Dr.
Sure.
Josh?
I'm good.
All right, okay. So I will pass the time to Dr. Stephen Boyce. You've got 10 minutes to cross-examine the other side. And yep, time starts at your first word, Stephen. You're muted, by the way.
One of the statements you made, Jim, was about the idea of the Maccabees closing the canon really around that time.
Sorry, go ahead.
Would you say that they were still open to the canon? It wasn't closing. It was more closing at that time than it was already closed around the time Josephus said that it was.
I didn't say that's when canon closed. I'm saying that according to the Bible, that was when Judas Maccabeus collected up what was considered their holy scriptures or scriptures that were important to them.
But they would not have added any more into the canonical status in their day.
Why wouldn't they?
They said the prophets were dead and that they were awaiting a prophet. They were in a transition period. Would you say they were in a transition period? That's why they made Simon the high priest forever until a faithful prophet would come.
Sure. I mean, there are a lot of scholars that believe that the book of Daniel is a Maccabean production, that it was produced by the Maccabees or a supporter of the Maccabees. So, I mean, and it fully supports their cause more than any other biblical text. So I don't see any reason why they wouldn't, especially if Judas Maccabeus is collecting these, towards 167, towards the time of the late dating of the book of Daniel.
But would you say they've already established that Daniel was a part of the ancient fathers, as they stated in chapter 2, which is actually the father of the Maccabean sons speaking there, that it was an ancient thing that took place at a different time, not so much at their time, but an ancient time given to the same status of Abraham and David and Elijah.
Sure, it's talking about these characters. Like the other three characters, we don't have any evidence for Daniel as a historical character, and everything points to him being a legendary literary creation, or possibly possibly a character that's influenced by the Ugaritic character.
I think we just lost Jim there.
I think you froze up, Jim. I didn't get that last part. I think your computer froze up on us. Is he there?
Yeah, Jim, if you could just repeat from the word Ugaritic, I think you're maybe muted as well now.
Oh,
yeah, you're fine now. Yeah, could you?
Okay. Sorry, did you catch all that?
We missed the last part. We missed maybe the last comment.
You were talking about Ugaritic, Dan L.
Oh yeah,
or
the Ugaritic character Dan L. It could possibly be a character inspired by him. Sorry, there's a storm going on right now, and I live in the sticks, so my internet is, yeah. Well, get over it. Just kidding. Okay, sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. So to me, what language, if a book was written in the 2nd century, what would the likelihood of that language to have been given the rest of the apocryphal books in that timeline? What language would it have been written in?
I would say in either Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, most likely Greek.
So if it would have been more likely in Greek, which most of the apocryphal works are, save maybe the Sirach, why would a work of Daniel be done both in Hebrew, transition to Aramaic, all the way up to chapter 8, and then trans back into Hebrew? Would you say that would have been the original text, or it would have been the translation of the original text in Greek? Which order would you put them in?
Well, I would say it would first be in the Aramaic and Hebrew, and then in the Greek, because it wouldn't be really conducive to the acceptance of it as a 6th century BCE text, as it's purported to be.
So you'd have to, or you guys would have to admit that this would have been a unique situation out of all those apocryphal works, where all of them were pretty much in Greek, and this would have shown up in Hebrew in the middle of a Hellenized culture where the writings had started transitioning into the Greek, including books like 1st, 2nd Maccabees, and 3rd and 4th Maccabees for that matter.
I mean, I don't think so at all. I mean, I think that just the fact that there is Hellenization present in the writings of the Book of Daniel shows that it had to have happened at least before the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century.
Yeah, but even the push of the Hellenization, would you agree that the push of the Hellenization is what moved the Septuagint writers in Alexandria to place a Bible together, because the native tongue of Hebrew had pretty much almost disappeared in multiple cultures of Israel, where not even Jews knew their own native language, except for maybe phrases or words or segments. And this was the big push why the Septuagint came to rise by the time we're in the Maccabean period.
Well, that's not completely true. I mean, it still existed in the liturgical sense. So in a liturgical setting, it still existed. So, but that definitely doesn't mean that there weren't scribes who knew how to write it, that there weren't people who knew how to speak it, that there weren't people who knew what they were hearing. I mean, and the fact that Aramaic and Hebrew, they aren't all that dissimilar. That also lends credence to the likelihood that they maintained their mother tongue and their earlier traditions orally.
Yeah, and to be clear, that's what I'm saying, that there was only small segments that would have been trained really in the Hebrew language anymore, like you said, liturgical. Like the priests certainly would have, the Levites would have definitely had that, but the communities as a whole were losing that part. That was even happening at points in Nehemiah's day.
Well, the tradition holds that the entire Torah was remembered in the oral tradition, that the oral tradition actually it goes even beyond what the Torah says. That there's according to Jewish tradition, the Torah is only just a portion of the oral tradition.
Yeah, and I typically make a large distinction between oral and written as well, because the Jews were all about memorization, but many of them that were memorized were also partially illiterate or mostly illiterate. Writing would have been another segment. But kind of going into this transition, so they're writing in a Hellenized world. Just a few years later from that time, you have Qumran. You have the scribes at Qumran. You find these teachings of Daniel in this commentary, for example, like the Midrash of Eschatology. And in that Midrash, it's stating that he was both a writer and a prophet. Would they have been unaware of what was taking place in this time period in the 2nd century, where they have been wrongly assessing Daniel's belief, who he is? Like, okay, they're calling him a prophet and a writer. And that would have been within just about under 100 years from their writings that are in Qumran caves. So where do they fit into this? Because they didn't perceive him as a contemporary. They perceived him as a part of those that would have been equal to the writings of 2 Samuel, Deuteronomy, Hosea, Isaiah. When dealing with the aspects of Messiah, they had him in that same category. So that kind of stays consistent with
guys,
what...
Can I please just request that since it's a cross-examination, we could just phrase it in the form of a question? That would be really helpful. Thanks for that.
I'm bringing it back around.
Yeah.
So when you look at Qumran, Jim, where do they come into the equation and go, all right, that looks fitting to what the Maccabeans were saying about the prophets being dead? They'd already recognized something being in the past and how they categorically did it.
Right. So when it comes to the preservation of the book of Daniel in the Qumranic text, there are only 8 manuscripts that preserve it. Daniel 12 is completely absent. Most of Daniel 9 is completely absent. I believe every text that we have is fragmentary. I don't think that we have one full chapter. I think everything is the biggest run that we have, I think, is like 5 verses. So I mean,
1 minute.
But the fact that it's preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls doesn't say much to me personally, especially when you take into account that there are several other 2nd century texts that are that we find in amongst this collection of the Essenes.
But would you say that that's equal to what they did? Because the fragments I'm talking about is not actually of the text. It's of a commentary of the text, and they quote from Daniel 12. And my question is, they're giving that statement of Daniel, they're calling him a prophet and a writer, which would have been within 100
30
years.
seconds.
Which would have been in 100 years. They're giving him commentary equal to Deuteronomy, Hosea, etc. in these Midrash eschatology fragments.
Got you. So you're talking about 4Q 147 or 157?
Right.
And A and I think it's 447 and 48. So those are, if I remember correctly, they are from around 75 to 90 BCE. And
right.
So I mean, that's what 80 years after the 2nd century date of the book of Daniel. So I mean, I don't see an issue there at all.
All right. Thank you, both sides, for this really fascinating cross-examination. With that, we move over to our Dr. Josh Bowen and also to Jim Majors. Which one of you, you know who will be going first?
Go ahead, Josh.
All right,
Come
Jim.
on, man.
You've been volunteered, Jim, to go first.
I feel like we've left my field behind, man. I feel like it's all you.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, so,
Jim, your 10 minutes starts at your first word, Jim.
Okay. So a question for either one, whoever wants to answer it. What is the prophecy in the book of Daniel that you believe is a prophecy? Like what verse specifically?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that we have to account for. And I think one of the things that Josephus reported on Profer is Profer realized that these events did occur. Now, obviously, some of the bigger prophecies, first of the Persian Empire, not only that, but the prediction of Alexander the Great.
Can I rephrase my question?
Yeah, sure.
can you give me an example of a prophecy in the book of Daniel that is not an event already recorded in canon?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean,
I think one of the others, when we talk about the prediction of the Iron Men with the clay feet, the Roman Empire. We also which obviously no one even in the 2nd century BC would have known to predict not only the rise but the fall of the Roman Empire as well around 410 AD. The other thing that we have to deal with from prophecy is the fact of the destruction of the temple, which not only is he predicting the cutting off of the Messiah, but the time of the destruction of the temple, which doesn't fit the Secludian king Antiochus going in and desolating it, but a complete destruction of the temple, which we see in 70 AD. So those are very clear prophecies that we see come to realization from the book of Daniel.
Okay, so two things. I guess I'll mention the Roman Empire first. What makes you believe, or how is it that you come to interpret the iron and clay feet being representative of the Roman Empire when in at least 3 other places Daniel explicitly says that it's Greece?
Well, if you think, there shall be a 4th empire like iron, just as iron breaks to pieces and overcomes all else, so it shall break into pieces and shatter. So now from Jerome, who understood that this was clearly refers to the Romans, is the Iron Empire, which breaks into pieces and overcomes all others. He describes that its feet and toes are partly of iron and partly of earthenware, a fact most clearly demonstrated at the present time. For just as it was first nothing stronger or hardier than in the Roman realm, so also in these last days there's nothing more feeble. Since the Romans required the assistance of barbarian tribes, both in their civil wars and against foreign nations. So that's how he understood that being Rome. And that's, one of the things that's consistent throughout is identifying it with Rome.
But why would the author of Daniel, though, like in the one who's writing it, mention the Greece as the 4th kingdom?
Well, and that's where the interpretation comes down to, because he mentioned, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and who is that 4th empire. Now, Profer interpreted that, and some of the Jews, as they understood that as Israel. But Jerome and other Christian writers of the period has traditionally understood that as Rome.
Yeah. So over time, people have interpreted differently. I mean, you have, like you said, you have people who interpret it as Rome. Hippolytus in the early 3rd century, I believe early 3rd century, around 200, has I believe is the first Christian who uses Rome as the 4th kingdom. And it's because at that time, Rome was already coming into power. Greece was already just a thing of the past. So in order to apply it to their time, Hippolytus, of course, interpreted it like that. And you might think, that's just a coincidence. There could be another explanation. Well, sure. But then you see a pattern of this happening as time goes on. When the Roman Empire becomes obsolete, then it's the Islamic Empire, and then it's you even have some more modern interpretations that use Russia or the United States or some other wackadoodle interpretation. I think that it's just a product of the theology, and that we should take Daniel at face value instead of trying to interpret it in the light of tradition or later interpretations.
Jim, I just want to ask if you could phrase it in the form of a question. That would be really helpful. Thank you.
I apologize. I forgot. Dr. Josh, you have any questions? I suck at this. Oh no, actually, I have another one.
Can I jump in on that one, Jim?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah. So with the interpretation, I think we all agree that there's been different theories early and later, like you said, Hippolytus or et cetera, about that fourth kingdom. I do think that you would agree that there are 4 kingdoms, not 3, whether it just explicitly says Rome or no Rome. But we still have to deal with the statement that the temple would be not defiled, but destroyed. So if 70 AD, let's just say Rome is out of the picture. Let's just eliminate them. So if 70 AD, the actual temple was destroyed, even if that were predicted in 164, 167 AD, or BC, excuse me, it's still either a awesome coincidence or whether it's Rome that belongs there or not, the Antiochus of Epiphanes' desecration cannot be the fulfillment of what he said there, because he didn't destroy the temple. Titus did. So there's still an act of prophecy. Even if we eliminate Rome and not get distracted by that fourth kingdom, we have a temple destroyed. It's either coincidental or there may be something to that. Would you agree with that, I guess? And it's not me asking you a question, I should stop, but I would say that there's an argument to be made there.
Well, I mean, I think that Daniel 9, it's like I said, I think the focus is on this last week. I don't think that the rest of it has anything to do with
Jim,
it.
just want to ask if you could just throw another question to them. That would be really helpful.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, okay. All right. So,
well, let me push then a little bit on. So sure. I think, Jim, what you were asking, if Daniel specifically says in chapter 8 and chapters 10 through 12 that this is Greece, he specifically says that. And the events that are described in Daniel 11 are specifically those of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And the language that is seen in 9, 10 to 12, 8, and probably 7 as well, connect these 4 events. Did Daniel get it wrong? Like Second Esdras says? Like, did he not understand it? Was it not revealed to him that it was Rome? And that's for anybody.
Oh,
sorry.
I think with these prophecies, once again, we had, not to berate Profer of Tyre. He was brilliant in his own class. He was one of the educated pagans of the time. He just didn't believe in moon people, and he was very familiar with the history of the period and the ancient citations from those that recorded the event. He understood what it meant that these things came to fulfillment. Now he understood that at his time, and which
30 seconds.
Okay. Who was the king of Jerusalem when it fell?
Guys, you've got about 12 seconds to answer.
Was Daniel correct about who the king of Jerusalem was when it fell? Or the king of Babylon when it fell? Or when Jerusalem fell or when Babylon fell?
Well, I would have to say whether if the report is 2nd century or the report is from 6th century, they would have
it doesn't matter when
Jim,
the report's from.
Your time is up, Jim. We'll just allow him a few. Really sorry about that, Jim.
Oh, yeah.
We'll allow Jonathan to just briefly answer that in less than 10 seconds, and then the time we'll just continue to your time, Josh, for cross-examination. But go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, yeah, I would say that the book of Daniel is correct. Once again, we are looking from history at 2,600 years after the event. There was full histories of that time available to men like Josephus, who was able to go back and write and corroborate on that time using the histories of the Babylonians, people of those areas that had the information from their time. So the question is, why would, or not, I can't ask questions, but I would say that they would have had the better information.
All right, Josh, the time is yours.
Yeah. So I guess this sort of leads me maybe methodologically here. And again, this is just for either of you, but Jonathan, since you were saying it, that sounds, do you then trust or distrust archaeological excavations? Or, like we didn't have cuneiform sources up until a little over 100 years ago. So Assyriology as a field has, blown up what we know about the ancient Near East. So do you think that first century historians, that you would trust what they say over archaeological data or textual evidence that we now have from archaeological data or material culture?
Well, remember, this position that we're debating is from Profer of Tyre. This is not something that modern consensus actually came to on their own. This is from the pagan. This view does not come out of modern archaeology in the sense it originated with Profer. But what I would say, archaeology is important. It does aid in evidence. I mean, for many years, there was information that we didn't have that does come to light. But remember, when we're dealing with archaeology, we're dealing with exhibits that we have to interpret. Historians, go and provide testimonial from examining records of their periods as well. As I mentioned, that they had records of sources that are not extant today. And this was published in a time that could have been easily disputed from the people that were still there. They had a library at Alexandria. If you think about it, the book of Daniel was translated into Greek. It was put into their language, and it was spread across their civilizations. There was ample opportunity for the period that was much closer than we are to make that analysis. I mean, they had many historians at that time and even afterwards that could have easily debunked Daniel that was already circulated throughout their society in Greek.
Would it not make sense with things like the burning of the Library of Alexandria and the burning of pagan texts that perhaps the only reason that we do have porphyry is because it was preserved in a Christian text?
Well, and here's the thing, the Christians are responding. So if we look at what's happening with Profer, a lot of the information we get are solely from the Christians. So what they would have been out there, if someone would have attacked them earlier, we would have had those reports as well. And this is the thing, there's many attacks that came out. Josephus reports about it. He was attacked, and that's what prompted him to write against Appian, because he was writing against the Greek Hellenistic philosophers that were denying that the state of Israel was actually ancient. So against Appian is actually responding to it. And we have many reports out there. So, we're talking about well-documented particular times that they had access to these histories. I mean, Arian is writing in the 2nd century, giving us full histories from that time. Oh, Dr. Boyce, you want to jump in?
Well, I was going to just add to that, to kind of what Jim was saying. I mean, it could be said that way too, but we also know that Eusebius wrote entire sections against Profer as well, but we don't have his apart from Jerome either. So it's not that, just Jerome only saved the guy that was wrong or the guy he didn't disagree with. We wish we had Eusebius' side of it too. History loses things, and that's why archaeology, I believe, is very important as well.
But there were early testimonial historians, not just Josephus, in agreement with timelines like Jonathan demonstrated in his opening. You had the Greeks coming in saying, hey, these are similar events. There are semantical differences because we all agree historians aren't perfect in all their details, but they're all saying the same things happened or didn't happen. And they were a lot earlier. And we know the later time goes on, information gets lost when we go through times of history.
Why do you think the Talmud says that Alexander the Great was met by Simeon the Just outside of Jerusalem, and Josephus says that Alexander the Great came to Jerusalem and was met by Jaddua, the grandfather of Simeon the Just?
Yeah, and so, and once again, what we don't have wrong, and just like in any investigation or witnesses, there are going to be minor details, but the statement of facts that Alexander met with the high priest is consistent. And what that shows from the Babylonian Talmud, which was probably compiled a little time later after Josephus, is the fact that it's an independent report. Now, if his report would have been exact to what Josephus says, then he was either cribbing off Josephus, but the fact that there is some slight differences in the account, what we have there is an independent source that said that the Jews met with Alexander, which gives credibility to the case. It doesn't take away from it.
The book of Daniel in chapter 9, there's a prophecy following Daniel's prayer, verses 24 through 27. There are three clear divisions here. There's a period of 7 weeks, a period of 62 weeks, and then a period of 1 week. What are the divisions of these? Where does it start? Where does it end?
Yeah, and I'm not going to say that's outside of my right. And there's been a lot of differences in these views, even among the Christian scholarship between Jerome and Eusebius and others. Once again, I would say that's a little outside of my depth in interpreting things. You know, from my standpoint, there are some. If it was written in 6th century BC, then he predicted things that he could not have known.
Would you also say that he predicted things incorrectly?
Well, some of the things are obviously in the eye of the beholder when we're looking at them. Obviously, Jerome, Eusebius, Apollinaris, Hippolytus. There are different things that came under discussion, even for Josephus, the way he understood that. So there have been differences of opinion in some of the prophecies that I don't, you know.
So in the context of the Deuteronomist, anyways, then we shouldn't take him to be a prophet, being as if he gets one thing wrong, then it's not the word of God.
Well, you know, one of the things is
50 seconds left. Yeah.
Oh. No short on time. Well, the thing is, they understood that it was composed in the spirit of prophecy. The Jews believed that that book was produced at that time. The problem from that standpoint is the documents at that time did not get in. And we have a superstitious tradition amongst the Jews that they wouldn't have added anything in. They felt that he had predicted prophecy.
If the Jews believed that he was a prophet, why wasn't he included in the writings of the prophets, but instead in the writings?
It's later.
Yeah. Now that was Josephus.
Go ahead. 10 seconds.
Well, Josephus does classify him with the prophets, not with the writings. That was done afterwards.
Because he did the writers of Qumran. The writers of Qumran also placed him as a prophet.
All right, thank you very much, guys, for that intense cross-examination that we've had. And this has been really, really, really helpful. And a lot of people have benefited from it, judging from the comments we're getting from the live chat. And with that, we move to the discussion phase, because again, what happened in the cross-examination is that we tended to get a little bit of discussion. We do have a time for discussions, 30 minutes to be precise. This will be free, and yeah, this will be free. Let me just try and reset my clock. Okay, we've got 30 minutes. Our time starts now, and I'll open it to any one of you to just have an open discussion, questions, comments, anything.
I'll just make one comment. I'll let you guys respond, and I promise I'll shut up and let Dr. Josh talk, because I know it's why everybody shut up anyways. So when it comes to prophecy, like, we're talking about things that are predictable, or that have predictive power. So I would ask, why is it that a 6th century author would get all of these things wrong, like all these events that he lived through? Why would he get the characters, the times, the places, everything wrong about major events? Because honestly, that's one of probably the biggest obstacle that keeps me from having a 6th century view of the text.
Well, a lot of what we try to piece together from the historical counts, and I mean us today, is we're trying to gather what historical information that we have available to put it together. So, and once again, it comes down to this view that, why is there this view that the Jewish writings, while it may contain some things that are outside of their worldview, are not able to aptly provide an assessment? Because some of the questions that you have around the historicity is either through arguments from silence or from other reports from other historians that may seem to contradict or view. And once again, I want to get to the facts as well. But the question is, we do have historians of the period that are writing. Why are the Jewish writings get this mark that they're unworthy for consideration, and we need a Greek source to back it up? And the only reason I say that, Jim, is because Josephus really documents the Jewish writing process. They just like the Chaldeans and the Babylonians, they assign that task to their priests. Well, this was done for the Jews too. The high priests and the prophets were the ones that are writing. They had standard practices. They had a number of scholars with them. So why would we feel that in absence of maybe a Greek comment, which, like Herodotus and Xenophon don't write till much later, because we have Jewish histories that go really far back, why would we need a Greek source? Or in some cases where we're trying to uncover archaeology, why would we, not saying take them at our word, but why would we just say that they're not worthy for consideration without, and I'm not saying it doesn't need to be corroborated, but why would we have that view on the Jewish histories apart from our worldview?
So
Sure.
I'm just gonna, if I could, Jim, I feel like that's fundamentally maybe misunderstanding at least the position of Near Eastern scholars that work with the period that I know. Okay. So for example, let's take something like where was Belshazzar when the kingdom of Babylonia fell, right? Where was he? It has nothing to do with the Greek source or a Jewish source. It has to do with Paul Lane-Bouillot goes and looks at the royal inscriptions from the period in cuneiform. Looks at the administrative texts, for example, and there are 2 administrative texts that show that Belshazzar has supplies sent to him probably outside of Babylonia, at least on the border, right? It's clear that Nabonidus, when he comes back from Taimon, that he takes back over his royal prerogatives, even the ones that just the few that he gave up for that co-regency or for that, for the crown prince. So it's not a question of, do we have corroboration from, like a Greek historian somewhere, does Xenophon say something about this? It's, look, we have this is how this works, right? I mean, we're looking at these cuneiform texts and saying, okay, so we know where Belshazzar was, and does this then line up with the biblical text?
Well said.
I want to go back to, are we just kind of open-ended here, or is it still?
Yes, it's open-ended.
It's open-ended.
Okay, I want to go back to what we're talking about in the time frame, like criteria, because I feel like our questions have bounced around a little bit to the 2nd century, 4th century, 5th century, back to what allows an opening for a book to come in. Like, if Daniel's a new work, it shows up in the 2nd century, who would have recognized its origin? Who would have been the people in the Jewish communities that would have allowed, whether it's 1st, 2nd Maccabees, for example, or whether it's Judith, whatever the book is, who would have recognized its timeline, its existence, its allowance, and would have written about what it is? It would have been the Jewish communities, right?
Well, there's certain parts of that the Jewish communities would have recognized, but would have been more ignorant about interpreting without help, of course, things like the succession of kings, or the different battles, or the different marriages, things like that. It's more unlikely that somebody who was unlearned would know about that specific of history, but things like the early court tales in chapters 1 through 6, Daniel in the lion's den, the 3 friends in their furnace, these tales, I believe that they would have had familiarity with, something that would have been told during the period of exile under Neo-Babylonian rule, as a way of, again, like I believe it was constructed in the 2nd century, for the purpose of encouraging them to maintain the laws of the Torah, and to maintain the Jewish customs and traditions.
But they would have had to, so you would say it would come down to the priests, or perhaps the princes, somebody in important levels, to allow such a text to be collected in and placed in, whether it's commentary, canonical, like with all these other books. My point is the Maccabees.
No. I'm sorry. I think you misunderstand me. I'm saying that it's more likely that somebody who was more learned would identify certain historical events in Daniel. But overall, I think that both the Jewish community and the learned and the unlearned would identify some aspects of the book of Daniel as it's written as being historical events.
But I guess the question is then, who identified that time period outside of Profer later, which was more in a linguistical argument, which, by the way, to be clear, I do think the book of Daniel had things done to it in that time frame. For example, I think Bel and the Dragon, I think Susanna, the Song of the Jewish Boys, I think all of that was probably compiled in the frame time that you're in for your dating of Daniel. It's not that I don't think that something happened with the book of Daniel at that time. You're saying what happened is it was collected of sections like 1 and 6, which go back to earlier times, coming into these new sections there, when actually Profer and Jerome were dealing with the fact that these extra sections were not necessarily the sections you're arguing for. It would have been the sections of the Jewish Boys, the Bell and the Dragon. This was the contention between Profer and Jerome.
Well, no, because Porphyry makes the arguments of Nebuchadnezzar being the king during the invasion. He makes the argument against the confusion between Jehoiachin and Jehoiakim, the conflation of Nabonidus with Nebuchadnezzar.
But you know that Jerome combated the fact that they were not the same king. He made the distinction. He actually talks about the ending.
No, do you know what his argument is?
Well, Jonathan had read it just a minute ago, and I'm pretty sure even on his screen, he actually had the reference to it when he was arguing Profer's position on that. And he
Jonathan, what is Porphyry's argument?
Well, he was using that passage to go against. He was trying to use it to show that the generation. He was using it to attack Matthew, And that's what Jerome reports in that.
Right, but how is he saying that Jehoiakim is Jehoiachin?
No.
Well,
Go ahead, John. Go ahead.
Oh, is my mute on? Or,
I don't want to interrupt you. Go ahead, Jonathan. I'll go after you now.
So Jerome says, "Let no one therefore imagine that Joachim in the beginning of Daniel is the same person as the one who is spelled Joachim."
Right.
Sorry for my pronunciation. In the commencement of Ezekiel, for the latter has chin as its final syllable, where the former has kim. And it is for this reason that in the gospel, according to Matthew, there seems to be a generation missing, because the second group of 14, extending to the time of Joachim, ends with the son of Josiah, and the third group begins with Joachim, son of Jehoiakim. Being ignorant of this factor, Profer formulated a slander against the church, which only revealed his own ignorance, as he tried to prove the evangelist Matthew guilty of error. So, yeah, that's from Jerome's commentary.
He's referencing Matthew 1:11, and says that basically that Jeconiah is the grandson or Jehoiachin. Jehoiachin is the grandson of Josiah. But that's just due to an alternate reading. All Jerome has to go off of is the Greek and Latin text.
But he worked with the Jews on the translation, so he had the Hebrew text because he was translating the Hebrew into Latin.
He himself wasn't translating it. He was the one basically transcribing it, essentially, according to tradition.
No, well, he reports, and we have lots of documentation. He had a team. It wasn't him by himself, but he was very much involved. He was trained by the rabbi, and he reports in working with the Jews, and that's where it comes up to discussion on these other texts. But no, he was trained in Hebrew. He remember Augustine attacked Jerome for his translation of Job, because his translation of Job made it into the North African church, and they attacked Jerome because that was his translation. So they didn't identify that work with some secondary writer. They came after Jerome. Jerome explained his reasoning for the translation of gourd to ivory. So we're talking about a Hebrew scholar that is well recognized. He was trained by a rabbi in Hebrew to do this massive project, from going to the Hebrew, which he said he did, to translate. And once again, he was commenting against other editors at the time that was working on the Jewish canon, saying that you have to do it from the Hebrew. So he was an expert in the Hebrew.
I wouldn't say he was an expert in it, because he didn't even begin to learn it until after the authorship of the Greek text. But he's known as translating from the Greek to the Latin, not the Hebrew to the Latin.
Well, he did the entire Old Testament, and he does
which at this time was already translated into Greek.
Well, yeah, but he went to his specific testimonies. He went straight to the Hebrew to do the translation into the Latin.
You're talking about his last version of the Old Testament, right?
Well, yeah, I'm talking about the entire Old Testament.
Right. So that was his last works or whatever. But anyway, this is it's
his argument. His argument was from Ezekiel, and when he was writing against Profer, he wasn't just fighting it from Matthew's perspective. He went back to Ezekiel's mentioning of it.
But you have to go to every mention, like in Jeremiah and in Ezekiel, they both mention who the king was during the siege of Jerusalem, and they both disagree with Daniel. Literally everybody up until the time of I guess Josephus is is against Jerome's apologetic, I would call it, because essentially Jeremiah's argument is that it's written in code, and that you can only understand it if you translate it. But once you translate it, well, then you can see that that there's actually no confusion. It's actually saying this king, but it really means this king. But which really isn't an argument. It's just a really, really bad apologetic. It's reaching is what it is. But and it's not something that's held by anybody today.
But this was the argument between Jerome and Profer, because Profer looking at the Theodosian perspective of this, and he was writing against, saying, well, why are people accepting this text? In fact, there's a part where Jerome said, why are they accepting this text? Because he was standardizing it from his perspective of the Hebrew text, which he also sent the researchers into Jerusalem to accumulate this information. His argument about Jehoiakim and so forth was on the basis of the Hebrew wording, not the Greek wording of it.
No, the acceptance / rejection between the Septuagint and the Theodosianic version was not due to that at all, not due to Jeconiah or Jehoiakim, but mostly evolved around Daniel 9 and specifically verse 25, because the Septuagint version included a punctuation mark between 62 weeks. The Septuagint put a punctuation after the 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which would essentially provide a reading of a combination of the 62 and the 70 to 69, whereas the Theodosianic translated it in the plain reading of it, that there will be that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem into a Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks the city shall be built again. So, and then you have the Masoretic tradition, which is different than both of them. So that was most of it evolved around. But for the most part, like, you're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls agree with the Masoretic text over 90%. There's very, very little variation, but it agrees with it way more than either of the Greek versions.
Right. But my point with Jerome was, and I agree with you, and I'm glad you said that. I didn't know if that would ever come up, at how much the Masoretic streamlined the Dead Seas. Even the transitions of the Aramaic is spot on. But when we're talking about Jerome, say that again.
Also, for the most part, yeah.
Yeah, there's always differences. There's
about 10% of the Aramaic that's left out.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it would be nice if Daniel was just in one giant scroll, and that would make life easier in the Dead Sea. But like you said, there's 6.
It'd be nice if any of the books were just one scroll.
Yeah. But we're thankful for what we have. It's better than most. But I mean, the New Testament has some issues with manuscripts that the Dead Sea Scrolls do better with, and they're older. So we're
not better than Assyriology. So just throw that out there.
I mean, not everybody can stick sticks in clay, Josh.
What would you say about the Dead Sea, though, where these scribes, whomever they are, are writing through these commentaries, which, like you said, they don't have chapter 12, which I don't know if you hold to the argument that, well, that proves Greek influence, Greek mythology, resurrection. Where
I think that there's Greek influence all throughout the book of Daniel without chapter 12.
Right, but does the Greek influence, this is my next question, do you think the Greek influence automatically makes it 2nd century? Do you think Greek influenced even the 5th and 6th century part of the world in their understanding of things, or in their intermingling of cultures, for example?
As far as Judea goes, I would say that from about 320 we see the rise of Hellenization across the entire region.
Well, you would have to agree as well that, the Greeks entered the Near East, really, I think it was the 9th century BC. They even built a temple by the 7th century BC. And even archaeological discoveries showed pottery there in great amounts.
that were going into the 7th century period. And I think it was, I cannot remember if it was opium. I can't remember who found it, but there were 2 documents discovered that were 550 BC describing trade agreements between the Babylonians of the Near East with Greece, with Tyre, with
Sure. Of course, yeah, that explains things like certain Greek loan words in the book of Daniel. Yeah.
Yeah, so the Greek culture was not like, so you wouldn't hold the position just because there is Greek influence, boom, it's automatic 2nd century, that there could have been Greek influence, like there's instruments in Daniel with Greek terms or.
What I would say is that in terms of a 6th century dating, we don't see any other 6th century text, Babylonian text that is, that express this level of Hellenization. I mean, while Hellenization did exist in Babylon, the text from Babylon and the Hebrew text weren't keen on expressing Hellenized ideas, willfully, without influence. Like the instruments, for example, the court instruments that are Greek loan words in the book of Daniel. While they would be familiar with the instruments during the Neo-Babylonian period, the Hellenization wouldn't have gone so far as to replace similar Babylonian instruments with Greek instruments, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, I know that even in the wording, though, Hebrew words showed up with Greek influences. I think Yawan is one of them for the settlements of Lonia of the western coast of Turkey. I mean, you've got different regions that did start adopting very early into that time period of the Near East. You do see it. I mean, my goodness, if there's a temple built, in the 7th century BC, there's going to be an influx. In fact, there were soldiers in the armies of the Jews and the Greeks were even working together at one point in different facets of war when it came to, so there's going to be some.
But you also have to remember, if the book of Daniel is written in the 6th century, it's not being written in those areas. The author would be writing under a post Neo-Babylonian Persian Empire in that area. I mean, you would expect to see Persian influence. You would expect to see Babylonian influence, of course, the remaining Babylonian influence, Jewish influence, but you would not expect to see a high level of Greek influence, so much that you have 3 words to reference court instruments, of which there were already historically similar Babylonian equivalents, and an additional Greek loan word, symphonia, on top of that. I don't think that it would have reached that level of Hellenization.
Well, guys, we'll just to announce that we'll try and wrap this up in about 5 minutes. But go ahead, Stephen.
So going into like Persian words or Akkadian words or something like that during the region of Mesopotamia, like in chapter 1 of Daniel, for example, like the Hebrew section, not the Aramaic, you have Ashpenaz there, and the Greeks didn't even know how to translate it. I mean, they thought it was a personal name, but it turns out it was actually the interpretation of an innkeeper, what we would say an innkeeper is. At the time, they thought it was just simply a personal name. They had lost meaning. Even Collins noted that in his book, that it was almost a lost meaning. You see, I think it was Montgomery that listed 12 words from the Akkadians section, or in the Aramaic section, 12 Akkadian words, and in the Hebrew 1, which would almost indicate that the writer was familiar with the Mesopotamia region. So it seems like if this guy is writing this book, whether 1 or 2 authors, he was aware of distinct terminology that Montgomery actually documents of Akkadian language, which would have influenced Mesopotamia. So you have Persian influence, Old Persian, where even Collins is saying this ancient term wasn't even known to the Greeks. They didn't know how to translate it. It took archaeological discoveries to understand it. And now we know it means innkeeper, but the Greeks thought it was a personal name in chapter 1, verse 3. And then you have Montgomery, and these guys are like, well, there's actually Akkadian influence. There's 14 in the Aramaic, 1 in the Hebrew, influencing Mesopotamia reasons too.
But when you look at the Masoretic text, when they're translating it from Hebrew, from their written and oral traditions, they don't seem to have that issue.
When you're talking about the Masoretic text, you're talking about in the
the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, where you have this issue with the Greek authors of the Theodotiontic and the Septuagint versions of Daniel. You find this difficulty.
Well, they found a lot of difficulties in words,
Sure.
which would indicate that old Persian influence that was definitely there. I think having Akkadian words in there shows that the writer was because one of the things you'd made comment of earlier was the influence of society. And I don't remember if that's the word. I'm sorry if I butchered your statement, like influence of surroundings. But if there's Akkadian terms, then the writer must have been familiar with something from the Mesopotamia region, even if there's just a handful, like 14 in the Aramaic, one in the Hebrew, that Montgomery lists. There must have been some Mesopotamia. So I wouldn't eliminate and say, well, Daniel's not influenced by its external cultures of that time in the 5th, 6th century period. It seems like the writer would have been with things like that, or old Persian terms that are in the text as well. I do think there's an argument for older timings that were lost by the time Hellenizing cultures took over, so that, like you said, these Greek texts, whether it's Septuagint, Theodotions, they didn't even know what certain words meant. They lost its meaning in antiquity. And even Collins had to say, yeah, this is an antiquity thing here where the Greeks didn't know it anymore. It was lost to them in understanding.
Right, but it wasn't lost to the Hebrews, is what I'm saying. And it makes sense that if Babylon conquered the Akkadians, if Hammurabi conquered the Akkadians, then it makes sense that those people that he conquered would, even those who assimilated to Babylonian culture, would still maintain some aspects of their pre-existing Akkadian culture.
Right, guys, we just have about 1 minute left, and just ask that you guys in the
sorry,
remaining
Dr.
1 minute
Josh,
trying to wrap this up. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so this sort of bring it full circle. The consensus thing came up. Both of you guys brought that up, and I want to kind of address it. Because this isn't an appeal to consensus in the sense that the consensus says that that's why it's right. And I think that needs to be clear. If we had stopped there and said, well, look, this is what everybody says so that we can all go home now, I think you'd have, a right to say that. The reason that consensus scholarship holds this is not some anti-supernatural bias. It's not some naturalistic, point of view. Again, most of the people on faculty at Hopkins where I went were Christian, right? But as Jim said, this just doesn't factor in. That's not how it works. The reason that that most scholars, both evangelical and critical liberal scholars, hold to a 2nd century date is because early historical details are incorrect. Not all of them, but many enough of them that it's strange. And the text is rather vague when it comes to its historical descriptions. So while it says things like this kingdom will arise and that kingdom will arise, it's very vague, generally speaking. Whereas when you get down into chapter 11, it becomes this guy from the north goes here, and this king from the south comes here, and this person marries this person from the north, and they have a problem, and then people die, and then those people are left alone for a while. The point is that those details become very, very much more specific and far more accurate right up to verse 40. And then at verse 40 following, it's like, oh, well, it just all goes, downhill. So, the fact that early is vague and inaccurate, late is highly accurate and up to a very specific point and very detailed. I forgot. The last kingdom is Greece. This is why consensus scholarship, not the other way around.
Absolutely. I just want to throw on one more thing.
Guys, the time is up, Jim.
Okay.
Yeah, really sorry about that. Our time is up. With that, we've concluded our 30 minutes of discussion. Guys, I just want to give really applaud all of you guys for having this amazing debate. Really intense. You guys kept it really respectful. Especially just want to thank Stephen and Jonathan for presenting a really good case for the Christian side, and also to Dr. Josh and Jim Majors for really making this a fantastic discussion for all of us. Really unfortunate that we have to cut it at the time. We do want to keep strict to the time that we've already set out. So with that, guys, we do go to the Q&A session. I want to pass the time over to James. And with that, I will sign out.
Thank you very much, Samuel. We'll jump into the Q&A, and folks, we have about 20 to 25 minutes, so we're going to move through these questions fast. Our first one's coming in from Explain Apologetics, which, by the way, folks, pardon me, I am going to add Explain Apologetics into the description as well, as we appreciate collaborating with them. And so you can also find all 4 guests linked in the description as well, so you can hear or read more from them, as we really do appreciate them. And this first question coming in from Finding Truth says, Dr. Josh and Jim, is it so hard to consider that Jerusalem was not, quote unquote, destroyed because of Daniel's prophecy? Is that an option? What is your theory?
Go ahead, Jim.
I mean, I don't think that. I don't know why that. I honestly don't know how that came up. I mean, I think that, Daniel talks about the rebuilding of a temple, and he talks about a confirmation of a covenant, and in the middle of that 7, he's going to put an end to the sacrifice and put up an abomination that causes desolation. But other than that, I don't think that it's talking about the literal destruction in that portion.
You got it. And thank you very much for your question. This one coming in from Don Folman says, Dr. Boyce, what is the prophecy of 2,300 days in Daniel?
I'm not exactly sure what he's asking. Is he talking about from Daniel's timeline?
He's talking about the prophecy of the days and evenings, a reference to the daily sacrifices at the temple.
All the way down to the time of Messiah? Is it talking about all the way to the time of the cutting off of Messiah?
The reference is alluding to Antiochus's banning of the daily sacrifice. So
up to the corruption of it when he defiled and sacrificed the pig.
There's that like 3.5 year period that goes through the second half of the book.
2,300 days and evenings.
I guess I don't understand the question, and he can ask me on the side, because he and I are pretty good friends on the side, so maybe he can clarify. I'm not sure. Is he asking what's the point of it? Is he asking why?
All they had asked is, what's the prophecy of 2,300 days in Daniel?
I guess the simple answer is it's up to the sacrifice periods, like Jim's talking about. I mean, I don't know if he's looking for something specific. Like, do I think it's accurate? Do I think it's false?
I think he's asking you where you think that what point in time you think that it's alluding to. I'm thinking that he's probably referring to the end of the 2,300 evenings and mornings in Daniel 8.
I would say it's probably up to Antiochus, I would imagine, with the sacrifice system.
You got it. And thank you for this question, or I should say compliment. This one coming in from Don Folman as well, who said, great work on this debate. So I couldn't agree more. Our guests are linked in the description. We really do appreciate them. And hey, if you haven't clicked already, you can find their links below. And that includes if you're listening via the podcast. So thanks for your question. Sebastian says, which method of distinguishing true from false claims of divine revelation indicates a conclusion that is exclusively concordant with one religion?
I guess it would depend on what parameters you have for your theological position. I'd say that whatever interpretation best explains the problem and exist within the parameters set for your theological presuppositions, I'd say that'd be the best one.
Yeah, I would say the methodology for sure. We go back to methodology, setting up those guidelines, following it through, inconsistencies, following through any error or disposition that would contradict, looking for consistencies.
You got it. And this one from EndoXD, Jim has a cool mustache, no doubt. And,
Appreciate it. You're a cool person.
Anarchist Weasel says, question for Jim. Seems like there are parallels between the books of Daniel and Judith in inaccuracy and Hellenization. Is this a fair assessment?
Yeah, there's also elements of First Enoch. Then that's kind of what you see with later apocalyptic literature. There's a lot of feeding off of previous apocalyptic literature or similar themes.
You got it. And thank you very much for your question. This one coming in from Farron Salas. Appreciate it. Said, I'm not, quote unquote, learned enough on the book of Daniel to ask a coherent question. So no questions from me today, but thank you to the participants in modern day debate. Thanks, Farron. Appreciate that. And Sentinel Apologetics says, question, if Daniel was written in 165 BC, is this still predates the Roman Empire's rise to power. And if the Roman Empire is in view in Daniel 2 and 7, then doesn't Daniel have predictive prophecy?
If only Daniel was thinking about Rome.
Yeah. I mean, this is sort of the point that we're trying to get at, that the particularly very clearly in 8 and 10 to 12. And I mean, I think through the descriptions of Antiochus in those chapters where it's clear that that's what's being referenced. You can see that in 9 definitely, and I think probably 7 as well. That Greece is in view, right? And this is why I think, and Jim, correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but in Second Esdras, when he says, what is it in chapter 10 or 12? I can't remember. He says, Daniel understood this to be Greece, but then he goes on to describe it as actually being Rome. So, I mean, that's why I think it's clear.
Well, and then you have the whole little horn being Antiochus. It seems like Dr. Boyce, you would agree that the little horn's Antiochus. So I mean, how can you go from that to it being Rome?
Because this is what you find in apocalyptic literature as well. And I think that's where we have to be careful with how literal we take apocalyptic literature. There are many fulfillments and consummations, That is both consistent in the Psalms, in its prophetic nature at times. It's very consistent in the whole entire view of Jesus's prophetic lines when he gets in the Olivet Discourse, where you're going down to Revelation. The book of Revelation, for example, takes many over the period of history in Jewish history, apocalyptic things that were fulfilled but not consummated. And so there can be like miniature fulfillments, and this is happening all the time in Scripture, miniature fulfillments where there's a lookalike thing that happens, and then it happens again. Like, so when Jesus talks about Daniel, he talks about the abomination of desolation. Anybody who was at that time would have said, well, that was what Antiochus of Epiphanes did. That's what Antiochus did when he desecrated our temple. But yet Jesus was still using that terminology, not as a past event, but looking to something that would come almost in a futuristic sense. So the question is could it be a miniature, not consummated prophecy? Because we have to admit in Daniel, again, what Antiochus did not do is destroy that temple.
But it doesn't say destroy. It talks about the building of a temple and him presenting the abomination of desolation within the temple.
But the end, but the end of the result of the prophecy was that the temple would be destroyed. And Daniel predicted Go ahead, Jim.
Yep.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead, Dr. Josh.
No, I was just saying, like this. That's why I say these are not disinterested. What I would consider to be like critical later interpretations. Right? These are theologically biased and motivated reinterpretations of a text. So like we had Dr. Stephen Cook from Virginia Theological Seminary on our channel. And we talked about Daniel. We talked about apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature is written in just such a way that it allows for this sort of flexibility. But that's the point of the literature, right? The problem that I think, and I have no expertise in apocalyptic literature, but I think that the problem is that saying, oh, well, Rome is prophesied about. And then you say, well, no, it's very clearly Greece. And then you say, well, no, but like it allows for that. Well, you can't stand on that, right? You have to say, well, that's a later theological interpretation. And like, I don't have any problem if somebody wants to say, well, I think God superintended that, but that's a faith-based position.
Well, I say that even if you think that Daniel is prophecy and is correct in the 6th century BCE text, it's still undeniable that the position that the Jews in the exile find themselves in 1 through 6, such as having to eat certain unclean foods or to worship strange gods, is the same position that the Jews under the Antiochian position were put under. So they would have certainly used stories like that, those found in chapters 1 through 6, as a basis for a text, or find it authoritative or even comforting enough to preserve.
But the point that I was making with that is that Jesus looked at, for example, the abomination of desolation as something to come even after that time period. So even the New Testament writers, or the people like the apostles or Jesus himself, also understood that apocalyptic literature to be more than, and I think you're agreeing with what I'm saying, and it sounds like,
well, I mean,
Daniel
what I'm saying
does
is
this.
Is that before you have the desolation, you have to have the building of the temple.
right.
So that means in order for it to be rebuilt, it has to be destroyed. So that means that it would be destroyed in 70, and we'd be talking about a rebuilt temple in the future. The temple wasn't rebuilt. There is no third temple.
But that's where the consummation part would come in, Jim. And that's the point of the writer, for example, of Revelation. And I know you're going to make the claim, perhaps that it's a faith base. They're looking forward to this rebuilding. I mean, even modern Jews are still looking forward to a rebuilding. That's what makes it apocalyptic and futuristic prophecy.
Right. Even the writers of the kingdom of Rome. But when did the Roman kingdom end?
410.
Yes.
I mean, a while back.
But at no point did Daniel say it would happen exactly by the Roman Empire, which is what we're all saying. I think we all agree.
He said that it would be the kingdom following the Roman Empire.
Be Greece. Yeah. And I think this is...
Or the Fourth Empire.
Yeah. I mean, but he says Greece in 2 of the visions, right? So
exactly.
But I think that the bigger issue that I would see here is that Daniel does this, right? In chapter 9 itself, right? So, he's looking at Jeremiah's prophecy about 70 years of captivity, right? And I mean, obviously Daniel's claiming that he gets this, vision from a heavenly agent, but the point is wait a minute, it wasn't actually 70. It was 77s, right? So we can tie it to Leviticus 26. But the problem is that there are 2 ways that I think, for me anyway, that you can look at this. You can look at this as, legitimately Jeremiah said 70 years, which I think probably wasn't supposed to be 70 specific years, but whatever. And that actually God superintended and he really meant it to be 77s, or, right, and that's a supernatural thing, or this is people writing later after the 70 years have long come and gone and scratching their heads going, whoa, buddy, like, what's going on?
Which is why there's no consensus among modern conservative interpreters.
I want to give the last word to Josh and Jim, since the question was originally for you guys. So Baron Von G goes and asks, wow, Book of Daniel, let's see, need to be an expert to comment on this one, so I shall stay silent. Well, Baron Von G, thanks for coming by and hanging out
Probably
with us.
Just making fun of me. That's okay. I take it.
S.J. Thomason, good to see you. It says,
oh, hey, girl.
Why are only 3 Greek loan words, in parentheses, musical instruments, present if his book were written when believers were living in a Greece-speaking world?
Well, I think I already covered this. I think she asked this question before, but if she didn't hear me, just to break it down, essentially,
it's an early
was
question.
That while there would have been Hellenization reaching Babylon at this point, and they would have familiarity with certain Greek loanwords, it wouldn't be strange to find Greek loanwords. We wouldn't expect to find Greek equivalents or Greek instruments that already had Babylonian equivalents being played in the court as early as the 6th century. We wouldn't expect to find that level of Hellenization that early, and we would also expect to find some sort of a contemporary parallel or a contemporary Babylonian reference that that uses, these same loan words as when referring to chord instruments, but all we see is references to Babylonian and Akkadian instruments.
Gotcha. And thank you very much for your question. This one coming in from Amy Newman. By the way, Amy Newman and CJ Cox are both linked in the description. They're both hosting after shows, so I encourage you to check those out. Amy Newman says, after show at my channel for believers.
What?
Is
Two
there-
after shows?
I thought we
Is there-
agreed on CJ.
Oh, that's right. So but ask for believers, is there any empirically detectable phenomena that is occurring when a prophet is predicting prophecy?
Well, I would say if someone predicts something that they could not have known or foreseen, and it comes to pass. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be by divine revelation. Obviously, there's people that believe in ESP out there. I don't know Jim's point of view on ESP or the natural phenomenon, but and this is where it goes back to Profer. Profer understood that what was prophesized in the book of Daniel came to pass. And that's why he centered, a whole work against it, because as a pagan, as a Neo-Platonic philosopher, he understood reading Daniel, what it meant. He understood the history of the time, and that had come to pass. So he obviously understood that if it was 6th century and it wasn't produced, then it predicted prophecy.
Well, I just want to say that even if we didn't have Porphyry or any of his arguments preserved, even if we didn't have any sort of polemic or a response to the book of Daniel as prophecy or whatever, we could still come to the same conclusions using the same methods that we use. Porphyry is not by any means a necessary source for a late dating of Daniel.
We'll give you the last word, Jonathan, or Dr. Boyce, if you want it. But if you want, you can pass and we'll go to the next one too.
Oh, no, we can go to the next question. I think.
Okay. Next one, Apocalypse here says prophecy, quote unquote, hasn't been defined in this discussion. Maybe I missed it, but predictive seems reductive. What do we mean by prophecy regarding Daniel?
I would say personally that prophecy is not just history that's being predicted, that it has a predictive power to it, and that is divinely inspired, something that is inerrant, as it's defined in Deuteronomy. That if there is one word or one aspect of it that is wrong, or that fault can be found with, then it is not the word of God, and that the person is not a prophet.
Gotcha. And this one coming in from, actually, I want to give a chance because that question could be for anybody. So Jonathan or Dr. Boyce, if you want to respond as well, you can.
I think
Or
Jim's
Dr.
answer is pretty spot on. It is a unveiling of something that is yet to be seen, that is released to somebody to understand. There's two natures to prophecy. There's a futuristic nature to prophecy. It's an unveiling. It's something that's ahead of time, that God unveils the human eyes to see outside of his own time and place. On the other hand, there's...
Well, I just want to add a caveat to that. I agree with you, but it also, prophecy always had a meaning to those who it was written for primarily.
Oh, absolutely.
Even if it prophesied future events, it had a present meaning.
Oh, no, well, yeah, and that's where I was going with that. But that futuristic had a application for its current audience, and they used different ways to understand it, like Daniel or the Apocalypse. They always used imagery. Imagery was a big thing. The horn was an imagery. So they would take a futuristic understanding and they'd bring an imagery of their day, their modern time, that they would understand, whether it's an item, an animal. They would use that as the means to give a writing. But there's also a second, but that's on the apocalyptic side. Again, prophecy is not limited to futuristic understandings. even in the New Testament, a prophet could be somebody who's just repeating that which was already prophetic. So there's two natures to the prophet. There's new revelation and there's repeated revelation.
Must move to the next one. This one comes in from Chris. Unless, Jonathan, did you have one that you want to add?
No, I think Jim and
Go ahead. We can get bogged down on this.
Yeah, I think they did a good enough job on this.
There's multifacets to it. There's multifacets to prophecy.
Yeah.
It can be expressed in apocalyptic, or it could be just straight up, clear, no imagery, straight up. There's different elements to the to a prophecy.
You got it. And Chris says, I enjoyed tonight's debate. It was a very pleasant exchange by exceedingly knowledgeable guests. Love to listen to Dr. Josh. He is always very modest. And next one coming in, let's see, Patrick Lowinger says, I want to know what Dr. Boyce thinks about Julius Africanus's, if I'm pronouncing that right, 2nd century CE claim contained in a letter from Origen that Daniel was fraudulent.
From Origen? Origen actually defended the status of the earliest parts. So I'm not sure what we're talking about, because Origen would have been a defender of the timeline of Daniel that both Josephus, Jerome, and Eusebius placed it in.
I think you might be talking about the pseudepigraphal text.
In a letter to Origen that Origen had concluded?
Well, I think it wasn't really, it just purports to be, if it's the one I'm thinking of.
But if we're talking about the real man Origen, he would have definitely placed Daniel.
No. If it's the one I'm thinking of, it's a pseudepigraphal author. But yeah, I agree with where you're going.
Yeah, I would say I'm sorry if I'm not familiar with that pseudepigraphal work, but if we're talking about Origen himself, if it's something that pseudepigraphal is saying that this came from Origen, it would not be accurate, because Origen made a defense of Daniel, and he would have placed it in the same exact timeline that Jerome landed it, Josephus landed it. He would have been on the argument and the side of where Jonathan and I are.
Gotcha. And this one coming in from Sentinel Apologetics. Since the oldest Qumran Daniel fragment, in parentheses 4Q Dan C, dates to 125 BC, and if Daniel dates to 165 BC, does this mean that Daniel was quickly read and approved by Qumran scribes no later than 125 BC?
Well, it can be as late as 100. It's usually dated between 125 and 100. You have other texts that aren't canonical, that are 2nd century texts that are found in Qumran. Several of them.
Gotcha. Well, R.K. Harrison made a comment about this. I believe he passed away back in the 90s. He had made a comment that the period of composition in any event absolutely precluded by the evidence from Qumran, partly because there are no indications whatever that the secretaries compiled any of the biblical manuscripts recovered, and partly there would in latter event have been insufficient time for the Maccabean composition to be circulated, venerated, and accepted as canonical scripture by a Maccabean sect. And I think
it didn't have to be accepted as canon, though, because the Qumranic texts don't purport to be a canonical collection. It's just simply a collection.
But Jim, that goes back to the fact that the fragment stated that it was written in Daniel the prophet. It was written. They did see him as a guy who wrote under.
Sure, but that's not written in one of the fragments of the book of Daniel. It's written on a commentary on the book of Daniel. So yes, somebody saw Daniel as a prophet. But the people who didn't would be like the Jews, whenever the earliest reference that we have to their setting of the canon of the Hebrew Bible, that Daniel was not originally placed with the prophets, that he was placed with the writings. The Masoretic text seems to be the one that you would hold to be more authoritative, being as you're using the Dead Sea Scrolls, which align the most with the Masoretic text.
Yeah, but if there's going to be an unknown provenance of this origin of Daniel that came, we don't know where, we don't know from who, And then within a couple of years, it ends up in Qumran transmitted, and a full-fledged commentary attaching it to the prophecies of Messiah equal to Deuteronomy, Hosea, Isaiah, and
I mean, I think a
and
couple
the
years
Psalms.
is
but
probably.
we know
can
from
give you the last
Pauline
word,
text
Jim
that
or
it's not
Dr. Josh, and
necessary
then
to know who the
because
author
this question,
was
because
in
this
order for it to
question
be
was
accepted
for
into canon.
Jim or Dr. Josh, I can give you the last response, Jim or Dr. Josh. Then we're going to the next
Okay.
question. Just to keep
I was just saying that I don't think that I mean, there's evidence that it's not necessary to know who wrote it or when they wrote it in order to be accepted into canon. You've got Pauline epistles that aren't authentic. You've got writings attributed to Moses that we know Moses didn't write. I mean, it's tradition does not equal historicity.
We'll jump to this next one. Appreciate your question from Ms. Metal says, do you agree Nostradamus was a prophet since he is more accurate than the Bible prophecies? I don't know who that's for, presumably for our Christian guests.
I think he's just really good at writing apocalyptic literature.
I think a good case could be made that you could obviously interpret a lot of that. So I do understand where Jim and Dr. Josh will be coming from in terms of spinning apocalyptic literature like that to fit a particular event. Yeah, I don't know if I would so much say he was a prophet as opposed to, yeah.
Gotcha. And this next one coming in from Patrick Lowinger sends in another question. Appreciate it, Patrick, which was, they asked, hypothetical, if a portion or majority of was interpolated, I don't know what of like is the preposition of, but they say added to or otherwise modified during the third to it must be Book of Daniel. So hypothetical of a portion or majority of the Book of Daniel was interpolated, added to or otherwise modified during the 3rd to 2nd century BCE. Isn't the text at a minimum a partial forgery?
Oh yeah, I would say obviously, you know, because what's being suggested here in the hypothesis that the work came into being in the 2nd century, and then it assimilated itself throughout, you know, Jewish culture into the synagogues. That's a vast conspiracy. So they forged work was assimilated throughout, propagating claim, and it would be a forgery. I mean, there's no other way to look at it in the sense of, you know, this isn't from Daniel in the 6th century. This isn't prophecies. This is, I don't know how to look at it any other word except forgery in the 2nd century, because you get it into, remember what's being said is, and this is where when we look at history, we don't see all these texts going in and out of the Old Testament. And that's what Josephus makes, that evidence of history is clear. We don't see things going in. While the Septuagint has 1 and 2 Maccabees, as great as the Maccabean people were to the Orthodox Jews, there's no history of that. And if anything would have came in. So if a work wouldn't have been as significant as the Maccabees were at that time into the Jewish canon, yeah, that's a vast conspiracy. It's a forged work because it's perpetrating to be someone to predict something at a time that didn't. I mean, Jim, you probably agree. I mean,
I would say, you know, like, what about 1st and 2nd Maccabees or 2nd Kings? I mean, or Ezra or Nehemiah.
Give you a quick response. Then we got to go to the next one just because I want to get these last few questions in. Sorry, folks, on both channels. There are a lot of questions in the chat that we probably won't get to, and I'm really sorry about that, but we do want to respect the time of our guests. So I'll give you a
go
quick
to the
response
after show and I'll answer anybody's question.
Oh yeah, just real quick, but those documents, you know, Josephus, the Jews, all tests came before, and what we don't see is all these books coming in the 2nd century. I think the biggest part that we're missing is any testimony from the period that's saying it's happening.
And 1st and 2nd Maccabees.
That I think what they're talking about is a practice there among the Jews that Josephus describes in detail how the surviving priests would take old records and compose them into new during times of war. So that's what Maccabees, it's talking about an ancient Jewish practice of how they are going to preserve their texts, how they were managing their records in the time of war. Josephus goes through that entire process that matches what not only Ezra did in his time, but what they're alluding to as well. During times of war, we're gonna the surviving priests will compose new records from the old, but there was a very strict standard process. This was left to the high priest. That's why any involvement in a work coming into the canon. I'll shut up. My bad.
I'll give you a chance to wrap up in maybe like 20 seconds.
No,
okay.
I'll just go. We can talk later.
This one from NOXD says, slightly off topic, but pardon my interruption, by the way. I hate doing that. I'm really sorry. But
no, I'm sorry, James. It's my bad.
NOXD says, slightly off topic, but if Ezekiel was alive during the rule of Nezi, was Tyre really a prophecy? He knew Nezi attacked it and the people wanted it destroyed. I don't know much about this. I'm just curious.
This just follows you around like a bad plague, Dr. Josh.
Yeah, I think, that the thing about it, what's very interesting that we see in history, and I'll let Dr. Josh respond to this because I know he's done some work on it. But the interesting in this prophecy is, the Jews are being laughed at, by tyrants, and then we have this prophecy that comes out about Tyre. It discusses the siege engines. It talks about someone coming from the same position that's coming. It just from history and reading the event of Tyre, it explains it. And the other interesting facet of it is now the tables are turned on Tyre, where Jerusalem is now spared. Tyre isn't. So that's either way too coincidental because it matches the entire scene, and it doesn't matter which event of Alexander you're reading, from Arrian or Plutarch or Rufinus. We know the direction that he came into. We know what he had to do with those war engines to get across the siege into the area. And what's incredibly fascinating is the fact that the tables are turned and Jerusalem is spared from Alexander, but Tyre was not. And I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Josh. I know you've done a lot on this.
I mean, I guess I don't know what to say about it. I would say it was a prophecy in the same way that I think, the writer of Daniel starting in 1140 was prophesying, right? And I think that was a genuine prediction. I think that what, came before in chapter 11 was ex eventu. And so, like, I think just as Jonathan said, I think Ezekiel's watching Nebuchadnezzar probably in either in an anticipatory sense or just watching it happen, heading toward Tyre or anticipating that it would go that way, and makes this prediction, which is part of the oracles against the nations, right? It is sort of this trope. And it doesn't come to pass, right? And that's what Ezekiel says in chapter 29. Now, if people want to take a theological interpretation of that, which some do and say that this was actually referring to Alexander, fine, you have problems. I mean, there are problems in Ezekiel 26 trying to make that happen. But, if people are okay with those inner little problems being in there, God being able to work through that, fine. I don't think that's what it is. But yeah, but I do think it was a genuine attempt at predicting the future.
Thank you. And MJT 532 says, would Dan know what happened to the temple at roughly 165?
I would say, well, obviously someone that's involved at the time of the Secludians, invasion of Jerusalem at that particular time. Yeah, I don't see why they could have predicted a destruction at that time. The Jews revolted. You know, the Secludians weren't very happy about chasing them up into their highlands. Someone at that time, if you know, and you'd have to probably write it pretty close to the event. I could see very easily where the Secludians would have destroyed the temple. You know, they did not. You know, they set up their own sort of sacrifice and temple to Jews, what they were trying to do. But I could see a person, if I'm a Jew at the time, writing, you know, the Jews revolted, and what type of punishment are you going to receive from the descendants of Alexander in that area, in spite of the losses that they incurred with some of those battles, that they would destroy the temple. And that's just my own personal view. I don't know, Jim or Dr. Josh, or you have thoughts on that?
I just have questions, not really any thoughts, but.
You got it. And this next one, and I think this is our final question. MGAT532 says there are 8 prophecies in Daniel 9:26 through 27, all remarkably matching events 171 through 164 BC, centering around Antiochus's persecution. Is that just coincidence?
Well, see, it depends. Like from the Maccabean hypothesis, if you've seen the events unfold, then it would say that, well, and this is what Proford's point was at the time, that it was just too close to be coincidental. So it had to be somebody writing after that time that was very familiar with those events, which testifies to its accuracy. And because otherwise, you have to come to a conclusion that he knew something that he could not have known at that point in time. So it's really from the perspective of, you know, they would only know that, well, if prophecy is true, and that came to pass, you know, that's what Proford saw. But if you were a person at that time who would have had to live through it and been part of that, one of the soldiers or involved in those campaigns, yes, you would have that information available to report on.
Gotcha. And thank you. Go ahead.
If I could just, like, I think this, because I think you're right, but I think this is where the early historical inaccuracies weigh in and are incredibly problematic for, or maybe not problematic, but drive scholars to say, okay, well, that's why this is sort of confirmation this is 2nd century writing.
Right. And it's not an assumption that's made that prophecy can't be true, because like I said in my opening statement, if we just assume that prophecy can be true, then we'd have to treat every text the same way, not just biblical text. But the 2nd century dating is a position that's reached by first examining the historical, the theological, and the literary nature of the book of Daniel, and then coming to a conclusion, not starting with the assumption.
We've got a final super chat came in. Oz says Dr. Josh's team won. Game over. Apparently we have a fan out there, Josh. And we want to remind you folks, all 4 of our guests, who we really appreciate, are linked in the description. And last but not least, thanks Doubting Thomas and Spider the Ateo for your super stickers. Appreciate your support. And so I want to say huge thank you to our guests. It's been a great time. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us tonight. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank you, James. And thanks to everybody for doing this.
Thank you,
Had a
guys.
great time.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jim, Dr. Josh, for everything. No, it's been really fun. Yeah, no, a lot of different, a lot of good insight into this.
Thanks,
and
man.
want to mention as well, folks, I will be adding, as I had mentioned, I'm a little behind. It's been a busy day, but I'm going to add Explain Apologetics' link in the description, and you can check out other debates like this one at their channel as well. And also, yeah, folks, if you enjoy this and you love debates like this, which you must if you've been here for 3 hours, which again, thank you to our guests. I want to say hit that subscribe button, as we have many more juicy debates coming up. And so with that, I'll be back in a moment with a post-credit scene. But one last thank you to our guests. It's been a great